Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The gas station that sold souls from Holland. Hanky been driving rigs for 32 years now, and I thought I'd seen every kind of truck stop, gas station, and roadside oddity this country has to offer. But what happened on that foggy October night somewhere between nowhere, Nebraska, and absolutely nothing? Kansas changed everything I thought I knew about the roads I've been traveling all these years. My name's Hank, but most folks on the CB call me Haulin' Hank on account of how I never turn down a load, no matter how far or how strange the destination might be. That willingness to haul anything anywhere is what got me into this mess in the first place, though. Looking back now, I think maybe I was always destined to find that particular gas station on that particular night. The load I was carrying wasn't anything special, just standard freight headed from Omaha to Denver, the kind of run I could do in my sleep if the DOT would let me. But about 3 hours into the drive, right around the time the sun was setting, and painting the sky those unsettling shades of purple and orange that always make me think of bruises, my fuel gauge started dropping faster than it should have been. Now I keep my rig in good condition, always have, so seeing that needle fall like a stone in water set off alarm bells in my head immediately. I did the mental math and realized I had maybe 40 miles before I'd be stranded on the side of the highway and out here in the middle of agricultural nothing. 40 miles might as well be 400 when you're looking for a place to fill up a thirsty diesel rig. The fog started rolling in just as true darkness fell. The kind of fog that doesn't just obscure your vision, but seems to swallow the world whole, leaving you driving through a gray nothing that plays tricks on your mind. I'd been scanning the horizon for any sign of lights, any indication of civilization when I saw it. A pale green glow cutting through the fog like a lighthouse beam through ocean mist. As I got closer, the glow resolved into an old neon sign that read, "Last Chance Gas and Sundries," in letters that flickered and buzzed with that particular hum that only ancient neon can produce. The station itself looked like it had been transplanted from 1950-something. All rounded edges and chrome trim. The kind of place where you'd expect to see guys in white caps and bow ties running out to check your oil and wash your windshield. I pulled my rig into the lot, noting with some unease that mine was the only vehicle there, which was strange because even the most remote stations usually have at least a car or two, locals getting their morning coffee or evening six-pack. The pumps were old-fashioned, the kind with the rolling numbers behind glass that you never see anymore. And there was no card reader in sight, which meant I'd have to go inside to pay. The fog seemed thicker here, pressing against the windows of my cab like something alive and curious, and for a moment I considered just trying to make it to the next town. Fuel gauge be damned. But logic won out over instinct, like it usually does, and I climbed down from my cab, my boots hitting the cracked asphalt with a sound that seemed too loud in the muffled quiet of the fog. The air outside had a smell to it, not unpleasant exactly, but strange, like old paper and candle wax and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and faintly sweet. I walked toward the station's main building, noting the way my reflection looked warped and strange in the chrome trim, like I was seeing myself through water or old glass. The door opened with a cheerful bell jingle that seemed obscenely normal, given the growing sense of wrongness that was settling over me like a cold blanket. Inside, the station was immaculately preserved, like a museum dedicated to mid-century Americana, with racks of snacks I remembered from my childhood, candy bars that I thought had been discontinued decades ago, and a soda fountain that looked like it still served phosphates and egg creams. Behind the counter stood a man who could have been anywhere from 40 to 400 years old, his face smooth but his eyes ancient, wearing a crisp white shirt with a name tag that read, "Proprietor," in neat script. He smiled when he saw me, a smile that showed too many teeth, all of them perfectly white and perfectly straight. "Welcome, traveler," he said in a voice that reminded me of old vinyl records, smooth but with a faint crackling quality underneath. "I've been expecting you. Well, not you specifically, but someone like you. Someone who needs what I'm selling." I told him I just needed diesel, maybe 50 gallons to top off my tanks, and he nodded slowly, that unsettling smile never wavering. Of course, he said. "Diesel for your truck. But might I interest you in our special promotion? Tonight, we're offering a trade, fuel for something you won't miss, something most folks don't even know they have until it's gone." I should have left right then, should have walked back out into that fog and taken my chances on making it to the next town. But there was something about his voice that made me curious despite myself. I asked him what kind of trade he was talking about, and he leaned forward on the counter, his ancient eyes gleaming with something that might have been excitement or might have been hunger. "Memories," he said simply. "Small ones, the ones cluttering up your mind, taking up space that could be used for more important things. That argument you had with your wife about taking out the trash in 1993. The embarrassment of forgetting your daughter's school play in 2008. The guilt from that time you snapped at a waitress who didn't deserve it. Little pains, little shames, little regrets. I take them, you get fuel, everyone wins." The rational part of my brain was screaming that this was insane, that I should run. But another part of me, a part I'm not proud of, was intrigued. How many nights had I lain awake remembering stupid things I'd said or done? Mistakes that couldn't be undone. Embarrassments that made me cringe years after they'd happened. What would it be like to just not carry those anymore? To have that weight lifted? I found myself asking how it worked, and the proprietor's smile grew even wider as he pulled out an old leather-bound ledger and a fountain pen that looked like it had been carved from bone. "Simple transaction," he said. "You tell me what you want to forget, I write it down, you sign your name, and it's gone. Poof, like it never happened. And your tanks get filled, no charge." I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only a minute, wrestling with the decision. Finally, I told him about a memory that had been bothering me for 15 years. A time when I'd promised my son I'd be home for his birthday, but had taken an extra load instead, prioritizing money over being there for him. The proprietor nodded sagely and wrote something in his ledger in handwriting I couldn't quite read, then turned the book toward me and indicated where I should sign. The pen felt warm in my hand, almost alive, and when I signed my name I felt a sudden lightness, like someone had removed a stone I hadn't known I was carrying in my chest. The memory was just gone, not suppressed or buried, but completely erased, leaving only a vague sense that I'd had a son and that I'd probably been an okay father. The proprietor snapped the ledger shut with a sound like a gunshot and gestured toward the pumps outside. "All fueled up," he said cheerfully. "Safe travels now, and if you ever need our services again, we're always here, always open, always ready to help lighten your load." I walked back out to my truck in a daze, and sure enough, when I checked the gauge, both tanks were reading full. I climbed back into my cab and pulled out of that parking lot without looking back, eager to put distance between myself and that strange green glow. The fog seemed to part from me as I drove, and within 20 minutes I was back on clear highway under a normal starry sky. For a few days, I felt great, lighter somehow, like I'd set down a burden I'd been carrying for too long. But then I started noticing things. My son called, and I struggled to remember details about his childhood, dates and events that a father should know instinctively. My wife mentioned things we'd done together, trips we'd taken, and I had only the vaguest recollection of them, like I was remembering someone else's life. I realized with growing horror that the memory I'd given away hadn't been surgically removed. It had been ripped out, taking other memories with it, leaving holes in the fabric of my history that were slowly expanding. I tried to find that gas station again, driving back along the same route, searching for that green glow in the fog, but it was gone, vanished like it had never existed. I asked other truckers on the CB if they'd ever heard of Last Chance Gas, and sundries described the proprietor and his offer, but no one knew what I was talking about. Some laughed, some told me to lay off whatever I'd been smoking, and a few, the older ones who'd been driving longer than anyone should, got quiet and changed the subject real quick, which scared me more than mockery would have. Now I drive with a notebook in my cab, writing down everything I remember about my life, every detail no matter how small, because I can feel more memories slipping away every day, not just the one I traded but others too, like I'd agreed to something more than I'd understood when I signed that ledger. I remember faces without names, names without faces, and sometimes I look at photos of my family and feel like I'm looking at strangers. The fuel gauge in my truck reads full constantly now, never dropping no matter how far I drive. And I know that's his doing too. A reminder of the deal I made and the price I'm still paying. So here's my warning to any driver out there listening. If you ever see a green glow in the fog, if you ever find yourself pulling into a gas station that looks too perfect, too preserved, too much like something from a time that shouldn't still exist, keep driving. Don't go inside. Don't listen to offers that sound too good to be true because they always are, and the cost is always higher than you think. Some things are meant to be carried, even the heavy things, even the painful things, because they're part of what makes us who we are. I learned that lesson too late, and now I'm forgetting who I am one memory at a time, trading pieces of my soul for a tank of gas that never empties, and a lightness that feels more like disappearing than relief. The thing watching from the woods from Mudflap Mike. They call me Mudflap Mike on account of the collection of mudflaps I've accumulated over my 28 years of driving, each one a trophy from a different state, a different haul, a different chapter of my life on the road. I've always been the kind of driver who appreciates the solitude of long-haul trucking. The way the road can feel like it's yours alone when you're driving through the small hours of the morning with nothing but your thoughts and the radio for company. But after what happened on Route 12 through the Montana wilderness 3 years ago, I've developed a new appreciation for populated areas, for cities and towns and anywhere that isn't surrounded by endless dark trees that press in on the highway like walls of a tunnel leading somewhere you don't want to go. It was late September and I was hauling timber from a mill outside Missoula to a lumber yard in Billings, a route I'd driven probably 50 times before without incident. The weather was clear, unusually so for that time of year when Montana can surprise you with early snow or freezing rain that turns the roads into skating rinks. I'd left the mill around 8 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and arrive at the lumber yard just as they opened in the morning, maximizing my turnaround time so I could grab another load and keep the money flowing. The first couple hours were uneventful, just me and my rig and the ribbon of highway unspooling ahead of my headlights, the radio playing classic rock that I knew by heart, singing along with nobody to judge my off-key attempts at hitting the high notes. Around 11 I entered a stretch of Route 12 that runs through national forest land, a section where the trees grow so thick on both sides of the road that even during the day it feels like driving through twilight. At night, with no moon, and clouds covering the stars, it's like driving through the inside of a cave, your headlights barely penetrating the darkness, creating a bubble of light that feels increasingly fragile the further you go. The radio had devolved into static about 20 minutes earlier, which wasn't unusual in this area where mountains and trees interfere with signals, so I'd switched it off. preferring the silence to the crackling white noise. That's when I first noticed the smell. Faint at first, like wet dog and rotting vegetation. The kind of organic decay smell you associate with deep forests and places where things die and are slowly reclaimed by nature. I figured maybe I'd hit some roadkill and bits of it had gotten stuck in my undercarriage. An unpleasant but not uncommon occurrence when you're driving through areas populated by deer and elk and other large animals. But then the smell got stronger. So strong I had to crack my window despite the cold air outside, and that's when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand at attention. It was breathing, heavy and wet. The kind of breathing that comes from something large, something with big lungs and a metabolism that runs hot. And it was coming from my left, from the tree line that ran parallel to the highway, keeping pace with my truck despite the fact that I was doing 60 miles an hour. I told myself I was imagining it, that isolation and darkness can play tricks on your mind, make you hear and see things that aren't there, create monsters out of shadows and wind. But then I saw the eyes, 2 points of light reflecting my trucks, running lights way too high off the ground to belong to any animal I knew, at least 8 feet up, maybe more. And they stayed level with my cab as I drove, never dropping, never rising, just maintaining that impossible height as whatever possessed them ran through the forest alongside me. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I pressed down on the accelerator, pushing my speed up to 70, then 75. But those eyes kept pace effortlessly, and I could see branches shaking in my peripheral vision as something massive moved through the trees with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for anything that size. The highway ahead was completely empty. Not another vehicle in sight, which was both a blessing and a curse because it meant I could focus entirely on driving, but also meant there was no one to witness what was happening. No one who could corroborate my story if I lived to tell it. The thing in the woods, because I'd stopped thinking of it as an animal and started thinking of it as a thing, an entity, made a sound that I felt in my chest before I heard it with my ears. A low rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground and up through my tires. It was a sound of hunger and malice, a sound that communicated in some primal language older than words that I was prey, and it was predator, and this was its territory I was invading. I grabbed my CB radio, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it, and started calling out on the emergency channel, asking if anyone was out there, if anyone could hear me. If anyone else had experienced anything strange on this stretch of road. Static answered me for several long seconds, and then a voice crackled through. Male, older, tired sounding. "Yeah, I hear you, driver. You on Route 12 through the National Forest?" I confirmed that I was, my voice coming out higher and more, panicked than I wanted it to, and the voice on the other end sighed deeply. "You got the watcher," he said simply. "Don't stop, don't slow down, don't acknowledge it, and whatever you do, don't look directly at it. Just keep driving, keep your eyes on the road, and it'll get bored eventually and leave you alone." Probably. That probably hung in the air like a threat, and I asked him what the hell he was talking about, what the watcher was. But the radio dissolved back into static before he could answer. The eyes were still there, still keeping pace. And now, I could see more of the shape of the thing, or at least I thought I could, though my mind kept refusing to make sense of what my eyes were showing me. It was too tall, too thin, moving on legs that bent wrong and arms that were too long and a head that was the wrong shape, like someone had taken the idea of a man and a wolf and a deer and mashed them together into something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. The smell was overwhelming now, filling my cab despite my efforts to keep the windows mostly closed, making my eyes water and my stomach churn. Then it did something that almost made me crash. It moved ahead of me, faster than should have been possible, and emerged onto the road about 100 yards ahead, stepping out from the tree line into the wash of my headlights. For just a moment, maybe 3 seconds, but feeling like an eternity. It stood there in full view, and I saw it clearly enough to know I'd be seeing it in my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was easily 9 feet tall, covered in matted fur, or hair that seemed to move independent of any wind, with limbs that were too long and jointed in too many places. Its head was the worst part, shaped vaguely like a wolf's but with antlers growing from the skull, massive branching things that looked heavy enough to break a normal neck. And its eyes, now reflecting my headlights directly, glowed with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware, unmistakably malevolent. I didn't brake, didn't swerve, just kept my foot steady on the accelerator and drove straight at it, my knuckles white on the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. At the last possible second, it moved, not jumping aside but seeming to flow back into the trees like water, like it was never solid to begin with. I shot past the spot where it had been standing and kept driving, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break my ribs. The eyes reappeared in my mirror, watching from behind now, following, and I realized with sick certainty that it was playing with me, that this was entertainment for it. A game of cat and mouse where I was always going to be the mouse. For the next 40 minutes, the longest 40 minutes of my entire life. That thing paced me sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, occasionally appearing briefly in the road ahead before vanishing back into the forest. It never attacked, never tried to stop my truck, just watched and followed and made sure I knew it was there, that it could reach me anytime it wanted, that I was only alive because it was allowing me to be. Twice more I tried the CB radio, but I got nothing except static, and I started to wonder if that other driver had been real, or if my mind was fracturing under the stress, creating comforting voices to talk me through the terror. Finally, blessedly, I rounded a curve and saw lights ahead, the glow of a small town, civilization, safety, witnesses. The moment my truck crossed what must have been some invisible boundary, the eyes disappeared, the smell vanished, and the oppressive sense of being hunted lifted like a physical weight being removed from my shoulders. I pulled into the first gas station I saw, stumbled out of my cab on legs that barely supported me, and immediately vomited into a trash can while a concerned attendant asked if I was okay. I told him I was fine, just the flu, just something I ate, anything except the truth, because who would believe the truth? I spent the rest of the night in that truck stop parking lot, doors locked, lights on, unable to even close my eyes without seeing that thing standing in the road, its antlered head tilted at an impossible angle, studying me like a scientist studies an insect. When dawn finally came and I forced myself to complete the delivery, I drove through that same section of forest in the daylight, looking for any evidence of what I'd experienced. I found nothing. No broken branches on a scale that would indicate something that large moving through, no tracks, no scat, nothing. It was like the whole thing had been a hallucination, except I know it wasn't. I know what I saw and heard and smelled. Now I plan my routes to avoid that stretch of road entirely, even if it means adding hours to my trip, even if it costs me money. And I've talked to other drivers quietly, carefully, asking if they've ever experienced anything strange in that area, and you'd be surprised how many have stories, how many have seen the watcher or heard it or smelled it. We don't talk about it openly, don't want to be labeled crazy or unreliable, but we know, those of us who've encountered it, we know there are things in the deep woods that predate our understanding of the world, things that were here long before highways cut through their territory, and will be here long after we're gone. The watcher, whatever it is, seems content to observe, to occasionally remind us that we're guests in places we think we own. But sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through isolated areas, I catch myself checking my mirrors obsessively, looking for those eyes in the darkness, wondering if it's still out there, wondering if it remembers me the way I remember it, wondering when or if it will decide that watching isn't enough anymore. The girl who laughed from the ditch, from Redneck Rick name's Rick. Though most folks call me Redneck Rick on account of both my actual sunburned neck from spending too much time at outdoor loading docks and my fondness for country music and cheap beer, neither of which I apologize for. I've been driving trucks for about 15 years now, mostly regional routes through the Midwest, and I've always prided myself on being level-headed, practical, not the kind of guy who believes in ghosts or monsters or any of that supernatural nonsense that some drivers will swear up and down is real. That all changed one night on Highway 63 in southern Missouri, on a stretch of road I'd driven hundreds of times before without incident. A night that made me question everything I thought I knew about the world and what might exist in the spaces between the living and whatever comes after. It was late May, and I was hauling a load of farm equipment from Kansas City down to Little Rock, a relatively short run that I'd done enough times to almost do it on autopilot. The weather had been bad earlier in the day. Storms rolling through the area with that particular violence that characterizes spring in tornado country, but by the time I got on the road around 9 p.m., things had calmed down to just wet pavement and occasional drizzle. The radio was playing, some call-in show where people were discussing their theories about whether the government was hiding evidence of alien life. And I was only half listening, more focused on the hypnotic rhythm of my wipers and the white lines disappearing under my hood. Around midnight, I came around a long curve on a particularly isolated stretch of highway, the kind where you might not see another vehicle for 30 minutes or more, with nothing but fields on either side, and the occasional farmhouse set way back from the road. That's when I saw her, or thought I saw her, a figure standing at the edge of the highway near where the asphalt met the ditch that ran alongside the road. She was small, child-sized, wearing what looked like a white dress that seemed to glow slightly in the darkness. And as I got closer, I could see that she was a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with long dark hair hanging in wet strings around her face. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving for help, just standing there perfectly still, staring at my approaching truck with an expression I couldn't read from that distance. My first instinct was concern, because what the hell was a little girl doing out here alone at midnight in the middle of nowhere? And I immediately started slowing down, planning to pull over and check on her, maybe call the police to report a lost child. But as my truck got closer and my headlights illuminated her more clearly, I felt a cold sensation crawl up my spine, a primal warning that something was very wrong with this situation. Her dress wasn't just white, it was old-fashioned, like something from 100 years ago with lace and ribbons that no modern kid would wear. And her face, as it came into focus, was too pale, almost luminescent, with eyes that were too large and too dark and too aware for a child who should have been scared and crying. I was maybe 50 feet away when she smiled, a smile that was all wrong, too wide and showing too many teeth. And then she started laughing, a sound that I heard clearly despite being inside my cab with the windows closed and the radio playing. It was a child's laugh, high and clear, but there was something horrible about it, something mocking and cruel that made my blood run cold. I stomped on my brakes harder than I should have, my rig shuddering and fishtailing slightly on the wet road, and in the second that my attention was diverted to controlling my vehicle, she vanished, just disappeared like she'd never been there at all, leaving me staring at an empty stretch of roadside. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking on the wheel, and I sat there for a moment trying to process what I'd just seen, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe she'd run down into the ditch, I thought. Maybe she was a real kid and I just hadn't seen where she'd gone. I grabbed my flashlight from the door pocket and climbed down from my cab, leaving the engine running and the lights on, and walked back to where I'd seen her. The ditch was about 4 feet deep, filled with muddy water from the earlier rain, and the sides were steep and slippery. There was no way a kid could have climbed down there that quickly, especially not without leaving tracks or making noise, but I searched anyway, shining my light into the ditch and along the roadside, calling out to ask if anyone was there. Nothing answered except my own voice echoing back to me. And that's when I noticed the smell, faint but distinct, like stagnant water and rotting flowers, the smell of places where things go to decay slowly. I walked back to my truck unsettled but trying to convince myself that I'd been seeing things. That exhaustion and the weird lighting conditions had created an illusion. I climbed back into my cab and sat there for a minute, breathing deeply, trying to calm down. That's when I heard the laughter again, clearer this time, coming from right outside my passenger door, and I turned to see her face pressed against the window, her two large eyes staring directly at me, her smile impossibly wide. I shouted in shock and surprise, my hand instinctively reaching for my coffee mug as a weapon. Ridiculous as that sounds, but by the time I'd fully turned, she was gone again, leaving only a handprint on the window, small and child-sized, but somehow wrong. The fingers too long and ending in points rather than rounded fingertips. I threw my truck into gear and peeled out, not caring about proper acceleration or any of the safety protocols I'd learned in truck driving school, just focused on putting distance between myself and whatever that thing was. The laughter followed me for maybe half a mile, sometimes sounding like it came from beside the truck, sometimes from behind, sometimes from ahead. Always that same horrible child's laughter that made me want to cover my ears and scream. When the laughter finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse, heavy and expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. I kept driving, pushing my speed higher than was safe for the wet conditions, constantly checking my mirrors and the roadside, expecting to see her again, expecting her to appear in the road ahead or somehow inside my cab. My radio had dissolved into static, and when I tried to call out on my CB, all I got was that same static overlaid with what might have been breathing, slow and steady, and much too close. I couldn't reach anyone, couldn't report what was happening, and I started to feel like I'd driven into some pocket dimension where normal rules didn't apply and I was the only living person left. Then I crested a hill and saw lights ahead, a truck stop glowing like a beacon of normalcy. And I've never been so happy to see a pilot flying J in my entire life. I pulled in and parked in the brightest spot I could find, right under one of the tall lot lights, and sat there for several minutes just breathing and reminding myself that I was safe, that I was back in the real world where little ghost girls don't laugh from ditches and leave impossible handprints on windows. I finally worked up the courage to examine that handprint more closely, and in the bright light of the parking lot I could see it clearly. Small palm, 5 fingers, but the proportions were all wrong, like someone had stretched a child's hand to be 20% longer than it should be. I went inside and bought coffee I didn't need from a clerk who looked at me with concern and asked if I was okay, probably because I was pale and shaking and looked like I'd seen, well, exactly what I'd seen. I asked her if she'd heard any stories about that stretch of Highway 63, about anything strange or supernatural, and she got a funny look on her face, sad and knowing at the same time. She told me that there had been an accident there, maybe 20 years ago. A family's car had gone off the road during a storm and into the ditch. The parents had survived, but their daughter, a little girl about 9 years old, had drowned in the ditch water before help could arrive. People reported seeing her sometimes, especially on rainy nights, especially drivers who were alone. And she always laughed, always smiled, like whatever part of her remained found the whole situation amusing. I thanked her and went back to my truck, and I noticed something that made my stomach drop. That handprint on my passenger window had been mirrored on the inside of the glass, like she'd been in my cab with me, like she'd been sitting in my passenger seat while I drove, pressing her hand against the window from inside. I cleaned both sides of that window with about half a bottle of glass cleaner, scrubbing until my arms hurt, but I swear sometimes I can still see the outline of that print, especially when conditions are right. when it's foggy or rainy, or I'm driving at night. I finished my delivery to Little Rock, but I was a mess, jumping at shadows, startled by every sound. When I got home, I told my wife about it, and she listened without judgment, just held my hand and told me she believed me, which helped more than I expected. I started researching that accident, found newspaper articles about it, found the names of the family involved, found a memorial that had been placed near the spot where it happened. The girl's name had been Emily, and her parents had established a scholarship in her name at the local school. Looking at her school photo in the articles, I recognized her immediately. That smile, those dark eyes. Even though in life her expression had probably been normal and sweet rather than twisted into something mocking and cruel. Now I avoid that stretch of highway whenever I can, and when I can't avoid it, I drive during the day with the radio up loud, and my mind focused on anything except the possibility of seeing a small figure in a white dress standing at the roadside. Other drivers I've talked to have similar stories. Girls in white or women in wedding dresses or faceless hitchhikers, and I've come to realize that highways are haunted places, crossing grounds where the living and the dead share space in ways we don't fully understand. Every mile of road has a story, and some of those stories don't end just because the people involved do. Emily, if that's really who or what she is still there in that ditch, still laughing at some cosmic joke that only she understands, still reaching out to touch the living with her two long fingers, still reminding us that the barrier between this world and whatever comes next is thinner than we'd like to believe. The shadow that rode in my passenger seat from Silent Steve. They call me Silent Steve because I'm not much for talking. Never have been. Prefer to keep my own counsel and let my driving do my communicating for me. Been on the road for 23 years now, and in all that time I've learned that silence can be its own kind of companion, filling the spaces between thoughts and allowing you to notice things that people who talk constantly might miss. But there was one 3-week period last year when I would have given anything for noise, for chatter, for anything to fill the silence that had taken on weight and substance and settled into my passenger seat like an unwelcome hitchhiker I couldn't shake. It started innocuously enough, the way these things always seem to, with something so small and subtle that you barely notice it until it's already too late. I'd just finished a delivery in Portland, Oregon, and was heading east toward Boise with an empty trailer, a deadhead run that I was only taking because it positioned me well for my next load. The weather was typical for February in the Pacific Northwest, gray and drizzly, the kind of weather that makes everything look washed out and vaguely depressing. About an hour outside Portland, somewhere in the Columbia River Gorge, where the highway runs beside the water and the walls of the gorge rise up on either side like the world's largest cathedral. I felt something shift in my cab, a change in air pressure maybe, or temperature, something that made the hairs on my arms stand up even though I couldn't identify what exactly had changed. I glanced at my passenger seat out of habit, the way you do when you're driving alone for hours and your peripheral vision occasionally insists it sees movement. There was nothing there, of course, just my road atlas and a couple of empty water bottles, but the feeling persisted. That sense of someone sitting beside me, someone watching me drive. I shook it off, blamed it on fatigue even though I'd slept well the night before, and turned up the radio to drown out the unsettling silence that suddenly felt too heavy, too present. The music helped for a while, and I managed to push the feeling to the back of my mind where it nagged but didn't overwhelm. By the time I stopped for fuel outside the Dalles, the feeling had faded enough that I'd almost forgotten about it, chalking it up to one of those weird moments of perception that don't mean anything. I filled my tanks, grabbed some coffee and a sandwich from inside, and got back on the road as the short winter day was already starting to fade into evening. That's when I noticed it in my peripheral vision again. Stronger this time. An unmistakable sense of presence, of occupancy, like someone had climbed into my cab while I'd been inside the truck stop. I turned my head quickly to look directly at the passenger seat, and for just a fraction of a second, maybe 1/10 of a heartbeat, I saw something. A darker darkness. A shadow that had depth and substance before it dissipated like smoke. My hands tightened on the wheel, my rational mind trying to find explanations, tricks of light, my imagination working overtime. Anything except the possibility that something impossible was actually happening. I reached over and patted the passenger seat, feeling foolish but needing the tactile confirmation that it was empty, that I was alone. The seat was ice cold. Cold enough that I pulled my hand back quickly. Cold enough that I could see my breath in that localized spot even though the rest of my cab was warm from the heater. That's when I started to get scared. Real deep fear that sits in your gut and tells you that something is very wrong, and you need to pay attention if you want to survive whatever's coming. I thought about pulling over, about stopping and getting out and walking around my truck to clear my head. But something told me that stopping would be worse. That movement and forward progress were the only things keeping whatever this was from becoming more real, more solid, more dangerous. So I kept driving, eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to ignore the way my peripheral vision kept insisting there was someone sitting next to me, someone turning their head to look at me, someone reaching out slowly with hands I couldn't quite see. The temperature in my cab started dropping despite the heater being on full blast. My breath coming out in visible clouds, frost forming on the inside of my windows in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like fingers dragging through condensation. The radio started acting strange around sunset, stations cutting in and out, songs playing backward for a few seconds before resolving into normal forward play. And underneath it all a sound like breathing, slow and steady and wrong. I tried my CB radio, suddenly desperate to hear another human voice, to confirm that I wasn't completely losing my mind. But all I got was static overlaid with what might have been whispering, too faint to make out words but clearly language, clearly communicative. I asked out loud if anyone was there, my voice sounding strange and small in the cold air of my cab. And I swear to you I felt rather than heard an answer. A vibration that traveled through the seat and up my spine. A confirmation that yes, something was there. Something was listening. Night fell completely, and Highway 84 stretched out ahead of me like a ribbon through nothing. My headlights creating a bubble of light that felt increasingly fragile against the pressing darkness outside. The shadow in my passenger seat was more visible now. Or maybe my eyes had adjusted to seeing it. A vaguely human-shaped darkness that was darker than the darkness around it, sitting with its head turned toward me in a posture of constant observation. I couldn't see features, couldn't make out details, but I could feel its attention like a physical weight, focused and unwavering and deeply unsettling. Every time I glanced over, it seemed slightly more solid, slightly more there, and I started to worry about what would happen when it became completely solid, what it would do when it finished the process of manifesting fully. I drove through the night without stopping, too scared to pull over, too scared to do anything except maintain forward momentum and hope that dawn would bring relief. The shadow didn't move much, didn't threaten overtly, just sat there and watched me drive. Its presence a constant pressure on my consciousness that made it hard to think about anything else. Around 3 in the morning, I started to see things in my mirrors, shapes moving in the darkness behind my trailer, keeping pace with my truck, and I realized that the shadow in my passenger seat might not be alone, that I might have attracted a whole collection of whatever these things were. When dawn finally came, gray and weak through continued clouds, the shadow faded with the darkness, becoming less distinct, less present, until by full daylight it was gone completely, leaving only that cold spot on my passenger seat and a bone-deep exhaustion that had me pulling into the first rest area I found to sleep for a few hours. I thought maybe it had been a one-time thing, a weird experience I could file away under unexplained but over, but I was wrong. The next night, when darkness fell, the shadow came back, settling into its claimed spot with what felt like familiarity, like it had decided my cab was now its territory, and I was just the driver it was choosing to haunt. This continued for 3 weeks. Every night as soon as the sun set, that shadow would manifest and ride with me until dawn, growing slightly more distinct each time, slightly more present. I started being able to see more details, the suggestion of shoulders, of arms, of a head that turned to follow my movements. I tried everything I could think of to get rid of it. Prayers I half remembered from childhood church attendance, throwing holy water I bought from a Catholic bookstore at the seat, even having a priest bless my truck, but nothing worked. The shadow seemed amused by my efforts. If a shadow can be said to be amused, becoming almost playful, moving slightly when I wasn't looking directly at it, leaving handprints in the frost on my windows, occasionally causing my radio to play specific songs that seemed deliberately chosen to unsettle me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. An old retired driver I met at a truck stop in Montana, who took one look at my face and knew something was wrong. I told him everything, expecting mockery or dismissal, but instead he nodded knowingly and asked me if I'd been present at any deaths recently, at any accidents, at any place where someone had died violently or suddenly. I thought back and realized that my run to Portland had taken me past a massive accident on I-5. A multi-car pileup where I'd seen bodies covered with sheets on the side of the highway, and I'd slowed down to pass carefully, had looked at the scene with the morbid curiosity that's hard to avoid in those situations. The old driver told me I'd probably picked up something then, that sometimes spirits or entities attach themselves to people who witness death, especially violent death. Especially if those people are already sensitive in ways they might not realize. He said I needed to tell it to leave, but I needed to do it with authority and conviction. Needed to mean it. Needed to make it clear that my space was my own, and it wasn't welcome. He gave me some other suggestions too, things about burning sage and carrying protective symbols. But the core message was about establishing boundaries and asserting my right to be alone in my own vehicle. That night, when the shadow appeared right on schedule as darkness fell, I pulled over in a well-lit truck stop parking lot and did something I'd never done before. I talked to it. I told it out loud that I saw it, that I knew it was there but that it wasn't welcome, that this was my truck and my space and I was reclaiming it. I told it to leave, to go wherever it was supposed to go, to stop using me as an anchor to this world. And I meant it. Felt that meaning in my chest like conviction given physical weight. For a long moment nothing happened, and then I felt that shift in air pressure again, that sense of change, and the cold spot on my passenger seat dissipated. The shadow was gone, truly gone, not just faded or hiding but actually departed, and I knew without understanding how I knew that it wouldn't be back. I've been driving ever since, and that shadow has never returned. But the experience changed me in ways I'm still processing. I'm not Silent Steve anymore, not really. Because now I talk out loud in my cab sometimes, just to fill the space with my own voice. To make sure any listening darkness knows that this space is occupied, is claimed, is mine. I've learned that silence can be dangerous when you're alone for too long, that it creates vacuums that other things might try to fill. And I've learned that the world is stranger and more populated than we usually acknowledge, full of things that exist in the margins of perception, waiting for moments of inattention or vulnerability to slip into our lives and make themselves known. The road is haunted, maybe all roads are, by the memories of everyone who's traveled them, by the echoes of accidents and deaths and moments of high emotion. We share those roads with more than just other drivers, and sometimes, if we're unlucky or sensitive or just in the wrong place at the wrong time, we become aware of our invisible fellow travelers in ways that change us forever. The truck stop, where it's always 3:33 a.m. From Diesel Dan, people who know me call me Diesel Dan, partly because of my last name being Daniels and partly because I've been running diesel rigs for going on 35 years now. long enough that the smell of diesel fuel is as comforting to me as home cooking is to most folks. I've always been a creature of routine, the kind of driver who likes predictability, who plans routes down to the minute and knows exactly which truck stops have the best coffee and which ones to avoid, because their showers haven't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. That preference for predictability and routine is what made my experience at the Crossroads Travel Plaza so profoundly disturbing, because it violated every assumption I had about how the world works, about how time flows, about what's possible and what should remain safely in the realm of impossible. I first encountered the Crossroads on a run from Atlanta to Dallas, taking Highway 20 through Louisiana, a route I'd driven maybe a dozen times before without anything unusual happening. It was approaching midnight, and I'd been driving for about 9 hours. Still had another 6 or 7 ahead of me before I'd reach my destination, and I was starting to feel that particular kind of fatigue that comes from staring at white lines and taillights for too long. I'd been planning to push through to a truck stop I knew just over the Texas border, a clean place with good food and quiet parking. But my bladder had other ideas, and I started looking for somewhere to make a quick stop. Just in and out, 10 minutes maximum. That's when I saw the sign. A tall one visible from a good distance, glowing blue and white in the darkness with letters that read, Crossroads Travel Plaza. Next exit open 24 hours. I didn't remember seeing this truck stop on previous runs, but new places open all the time and I was in no position to be picky. So I took the exit and followed a 2-lane road for about a mile before the truck stop appeared. A sprawling complex of parking lot and building that looked modern and well-maintained. The lot was maybe a quarter full, a decent number of trucks parked in neat rows, and I found a spot easily, parked and climbed down from my cab, grateful for the chance to stretch my legs and take care of biological necessities. The air outside had a strange quality to it, not cold exactly despite it being December, but thin somehow. Like atmosphere at high altitude even though I was barely above sea level. The lighting in the parking lot was bright, almost too bright, casting stark shadows and making everything look slightly overexposed, like a photograph with the contrast turned up too high. I walked toward the main building, noting that while there were plenty of trucks in the lot, I didn't see any other drivers moving around, no one else walking to or from the building. Which was unusual because truck stops are usually hubs of activity, people coming and going at all hours. Inside, the place was immaculate, almost sterile in its cleanliness, with tile floors that gleamed under fluorescent lights and shelves stocked with the usual truck stop merchandise. Snacks and drinks and trucker supplies all arranged with geometric precision. There was a restaurant area to my left, booths with red vinyl seats and a counter with stools, and a convenience store area to my right with rows of coolers and racks of packaged food. But what struck me immediately was the silence, the absolute lack of ambient noise that should characterize a functioning truck stop. No music playing, no hum of conversation, no clatter of dishes or ding of the cash register, and there were no other customers visible despite the number of trucks outside, which sent a small warning signal through my brain that I chose to ignore, because I really needed to use the bathroom. I walked toward the restrooms, my footsteps echoing in the strange silence, and that's when I noticed the clock on the wall, a standard institutional clock with a white face and black numbers. It read 3:33, and I thought that couldn't be right because it had been just before midnight when I'd exited the highway, meaning I'd lost somehow 3.5 hours without being aware of it, which was impossible. I checked my watch, an old analog one my father had given me that I kept wound and accurate, and it showed 11:58, confirming that the wall clock was wrong. I figured it just needed new batteries or had stopped and no one had noticed yet. And I continued to the restroom, which was as immaculately clean as everything else, smelling strongly of industrial cleaner. After taking care of business and washing my hands in water that ran ice cold regardless of which tap I turned, I walked back out into the main area and noticed a clerk standing behind the counter. A young man, maybe in his 20s, wearing a crisp blue uniform with a name tag that read "Employee" in plain black letters. I hadn't seen him when I'd first entered, and I hadn't heard him arrive, but there he was, smiling at me with a bland professional friendliness that didn't quite reach his eyes. I nodded to him and asked where the coffee was, and he pointed to a station along the far wall without speaking, his smile never wavering, his eyes never quite making full contact with mine. I poured myself a large cup of coffee, noting that it was perfectly hot and fresh despite the apparent lack of customers, and walked around the store for a few minutes, looking at the merchandise and trying to shake the feeling of wrongness that was growing stronger with each passing moment. Every clock I could see, and there were several scattered throughout the store, all read 3:33. Their second hands frozen in place or moving so slowly I couldn't detect the movement. I checked my watch again and it showed 12:07, meaning about 9 minutes had passed since I'd first checked it. So time was clearly moving normally for me, even if not for the clocks on the walls. I decided to ask the clerk about it, walked up to the counter where he stood motionless except for that fixed smile, and pointed at the clock behind him. "Your clocks are all stopped," I said, and he turned slowly to look at the clock, then turned back to me with that same smile, and said in a voice that sounded slightly artificial, slightly too measured, "It's always 3:33 here, always has been, always will be." The way he said it, flat and certain, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and I asked him what he meant by that. But he just kept smiling and didn't answer, just stood there staring at me with eyes that I now realized were slightly wrong. The pupils just a bit too large, not quite tracking movement the way eyes should. I put my coffee cup down on the counter, no longer interested in drinking it, and told him I needed to pay for my fuel. Even though I hadn't actually fueled up, I just wanted an excuse to complete a transaction and get the hell out of there. He said there would be no charge, that everything at the crossroads was complimentary for travelers, and when I insisted on paying, said I felt uncomfortable not paying. He just shook his head slowly and repeated that there was no charge. It was policy. Everyone who stopped at the crossroads at 3:33 was a guest, not a customer. The way he emphasized 3:33 made it clear he was referring to the frozen time on the clocks, not any actual time, and I decided I'd had enough of this weirdness and needed to leave immediately. I walked quickly toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in that unnatural silence, and pushed through the doors into the parking lot. The air outside seemed even thinner than before, and the lighting seemed brighter, the shadows darker. Everything hyper-real in a way that made my eyes hurt. I walked toward my truck, walking faster than I normally would, resisting the urge to break into a run because running would mean admitting I was scared, and I wasn't ready to admit that yet. As I approached my rig, I noticed something that stopped me cold. There was a thin layer of dust on my truck. Not just road dirt, but actual dust. The kind of dust that accumulates over days or weeks of sitting motionless. I'd parked maybe 15 minutes ago and my truck had been clean, and now it looked like it had been sitting abandoned for a significant period of time. I climbed into my cab, my hands shaking as I turned the key, and experienced a moment of pure terror when the engine didn't start immediately, just turned over sluggishly like the battery was low. On the third try it caught, and I'd never been so relieved to hear my engine roar to life. I threw the truck into gear and started rolling toward the exit, glancing at my watch and seeing that it now showed 12:19, meaning only about 20 minutes had passed since I'd first arrived. Even though it felt like longer, even though the dust on my truck suggested much longer. I looked in my rearview mirror at the Crossroads Travel Plaza, and I could swear the building looked different, older, more faded, like I was seeing it through a filter that showed its true age rather than the modern facade I'd initially perceived. The exit road seemed longer driving out than it had driving in, stretching ahead of me for what felt like miles, though I knew it had only been about a mile from the highway. The air had a quality like driving through fog, even though I could see perfectly clearly. And I had the unsettling sensation of moving through something resistant. Like the space itself didn't want to let me go. Wanted to keep me at the crossroads where it was always 333. Finally, I reached the highway, pulled back onto the main road, and immediately felt the oppressive atmosphere lift. Felt the air return to normal. Felt like I'd escaped from something that had been reaching for me with invisible hands. I drove for another hour before I stopped again. This time at a truck stop I knew for certain had existed for years. And I sat in the parking lot for a long time just breathing and trying to process what had happened. My watch showed the correct time, my truck's clock matched my watch, and everything felt normal and real in a way that the crossroads hadn't. I went inside this normal truck stop, saw other drivers, heard conversation and music and the normal sounds of commerce and human activity, and I almost cried with relief at the mundane normalcy of it all. I asked the clerk if he knew anything about a place called Crossroads Travel Plaza on Highway 20, and he looked at me strangely and said there was no truck stop by that name on this highway, that he'd worked this area for 10 years and knew every stopping point within 100 miles. Over the next few weeks, I tried to research the crossroads, looking at maps and truck stop directories and even satellite images of that section of highway, and I found nothing. No evidence that it existed or had ever existed. I talked to other drivers who ran that route regularly, and none of them had heard of it. None of them had seen it. And the ones who believed me at all suggested I'd been so tired I'd hallucinated the whole thing. Dreamed it while pulled over on the side of the road. But I know what I experienced, I know I was awake and aware, and I have proof. That cup of coffee from the crossroads that I'd set down but apparently taken with me anyway, that I found in my cup holder when I got home, it's still in my garage sitting on a shelf, and the coffee inside has never evaporated. Never grown mold, never changed at all. Like time doesn't affect it the way time affects normal things. I've driven that route several more times since then, always during different times of day. Always watching for that exit, and I've never seen it again. Never seen any sign that it exists. But sometimes late at night when I'm driving alone through isolated areas, I'll see other drivers on my CB asking if anyone knows about the crossroads, describing experiences similar to mine. Time that doesn't move properly. Clocks frozen at 3:33. Clerks who smile without smiling, and I'll confirm that yes, I know about it, yes, it's real, and no, you're not crazy. There are thin places in the world where the normal rules don't fully apply, where time can pool and eddy like water in strange currents, where you can step out of the regular flow of cause and effect and into something else, something that exists parallel to our world but not quite part of it. The Crossroads Travel Plaza is one of those places, and the fact that it appears to different people at different times and locations suggests that it's not anchored to any specific geographic point, but rather to something else, some condition or state that attracts it like a moth to light. Now I'm more careful about where I stop, more attentive to signs that something might be off, unusual lighting or missing sounds or clocks that don't match my watch. I've learned that not every exit leads somewhere you want to go, that not every open door is an invitation you should accept. The road is full of waypoints and rest stops and places that offer shelter and services to weary travelers, but some of those places exist in the margins, in the spaces between, and if you're not careful, you might stop at a place where it's always 3:33, where time has stopped or never started, where the smiling clerks will welcome you as a guest and you'll never leave because leaving requires time to pass, and time has forgotten how to move forward. I was lucky I got out, but I wonder about the trucks I saw parked in that lot, about the drivers who should have been visible but weren't, about whether they're still there in some sense, trapped in that moment, that frozen instant, still believing they've only stopped for a few minutes and will be back on the road soon, not realizing that for them, soon will never come because it's always 3:33, the woman who appeared in my mirror from Highway Hank. They call me Highway Hank because I've spent more of my life on highways than off them. 42 years behind the wheel of long-haul trucks, crisscrossing this country so many times I've probably driven the equivalent of to the moon and back, several times over. I've always been observant, the kind of driver who notices details, who can tell you about the landmarks and the changes to familiar routes, who prides himself on being aware of his surroundings at all times. That attention to detail is what made what happened to me 3 years ago so particularly disturbing, because I noticed her immediately, but I couldn't do anything about her. Couldn't make her go away. Couldn't understand what she wanted or why she'd chosen me. It started on a routine run from Memphis to Phoenix, a long haul across the southern tier of the country that I'd made hundreds of times before. I'd left Memphis around midnight, planning to drive straight through with minimal stops, make good time while traffic was light, arrive in Phoenix early and maybe have time to grab a decent meal and a shower before the next load. The night was clear and cool, perfect driving weather, and I was making excellent time, sailing through Arkansas and into Oklahoma without any issues. Around 4 in the morning, somewhere in the middle of Oklahoma's long, empty stretches, I glanced at my rearview mirror to check the road behind me, a habit so ingrained I do it every few seconds without thinking, and that's when I saw her for the first time. She was sitting in the sleeper berth behind my seat, visible in the mirror, a woman who appeared to be in her 30s with long dark hair and pale skin, wearing what looked like a white nightgown or dress. For a split second, my brain didn't register the impossibility of what I was seeing. Didn't process that I was supposed to be alone in my cab, that my sleeper berth had been empty when I checked it before leaving Memphis. Then reality caught up with perception and I jerked in my seat, twisting around to look directly at the sleeper berth, my heart hammering, my hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron I keep wedged beside my seat for emergencies. The sleeper berth was empty, completely empty. Nothing there but my sleeping bag and a pillow and the clutter of personal items I keep back there. I turned back around, breathing hard, telling myself I'd been seeing things, that fatigue was playing tricks on my eyes despite the fact that I'd slept well before starting this run and didn't feel tired. I looked at the mirror again and she was still there, still sitting in my sleeper berth, still staring at me with eyes that looked dark and bottomless in the dim light. I could see her clearly, could see the way her hair fell around her shoulders, could see her hands folded in her lap, could see her chest rising and falling with breath. But when I turned around again to look directly, there was nothing, just my empty sleeper berth. She existed only in the mirror, only in reflection, visible when I looked at her indirectly, but vanishing when I tried to observe her directly. My hands were shaking on the wheel, and I seriously considered pulling over, getting out of my truck, maybe calling for help, but what would I say? That I was seeing a ghost woman in my mirror who disappeared when I looked at her directly. They'd think I was having a breakdown, maybe mandate some kind of psychological evaluation before letting me drive again, and I couldn't afford that. Couldn't afford to lose my CDL over something I couldn't explain or prove. So I kept driving, trying to ignore the mirror, trying to focus on the road ahead. But my eyes kept being drawn back to that reflection, to the woman who sat so still and silent in my sleeper berth, watching me drive with an expression I couldn't read. As dawn started to break, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, I hoped desperately that daylight would make her disappear, that she was some creature of darkness that couldn't exist in the light of day. But when the sun came up fully and light flooded my cab, she was still there in the mirror, perhaps even more clearly visible now that I could see details I'd missed in the darkness. Her nightgown was old-fashioned, Victorian maybe, with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her face was beautiful in a classical way, but also profoundly sad, with dark circles under her eyes and a downturned mouth that suggested grief or despair. And her eyes, when they met mine in the mirror, were filled with something that looked like pleading, like she wanted to communicate something but couldn't find the words or the means. I stopped for fuel and food in Amarillo, and while I was outside my truck, I examined the sleeper berth carefully, looking for any explanation, any trick of light or reflection that could account for what I was seeing. I found nothing out of place, nothing that could create the illusion of a woman sitting there. I climbed back into my cab with a feeling of dread, not wanting to look at the mirror but unable to help myself. And there she was, still in the same position, still watching me with those pleading eyes. I tried speaking to her, feeling foolish but desperate for any kind of response. I asked her who she was, what she wanted, why she was in my truck. But she didn't respond, didn't move, just continued to stare at me through the mirror. The rest of the drive to Phoenix was a psychological ordeal, constantly aware of her presence, constantly fighting the urge to look at the mirror, constantly jumping at shadows and trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Other drivers on the CB noticed something was off, asked if I was okay when my voice sounded strained or distracted, and I made excuses about being tired or fighting off a cold, anything except the truth. I delivered my load, and during the time I was at the receiving dock, I stayed outside my truck as much as possible, hoping irrationally that maybe she'd leave while I wasn't there to observe her. But when I got back in to head to my next pickup, she was still there, patient and persistent and silently present. This continued for 3 days, this woman appearing in my mirror constantly, never moving from her position in the sleeper berth, never speaking or attempting to communicate beyond those pleading eyes. I couldn't sleep properly because even when I tried to rest in the sleeper berth, I was aware of her presence, aware that if I looked in any reflective surface, I'd see her sitting there with me, sharing that small space. I was becoming exhausted, both from lack of sleep and from the psychological strain of dealing with something I couldn't explain or escape. And I knew I needed to find answers or I'd have to quit driving, which would devastate me because driving is all I've ever known, all I've ever wanted to do. I started researching, using my phone during breaks to search for similar experiences, looking for patterns or explanations. I found stories from other drivers, accounts of ghostly passengers and hitchhikers and apparitions, but none that matched my specific situation exactly. Then I came across a forum post from a paranormal investigator who specialized in vehicle hauntings, and I sent him a message describing what I was experiencing. He responded within a few hours, asking specific questions about when and where I'd first seen her, about any accidents or unusual events on that route, about the age and history of my truck. My truck was relatively new, only 3 years old, so it didn't have a long history, but the investigator suggested that sometimes spirits attach themselves not to the vehicle, but to the driver, particularly if the driver had been in the vicinity of a death or tragedy, and the spirit needed help or recognition. He asked me to try something the next time I saw her in the mirror. Instead of being afraid or trying to ignore her, I should acknowledge her directly, speak to her, ask what she needed, and really listen for any kind of response. Not just verbal, but emotional or intuitive. That night, parked in a rest area outside Albuquerque, I forced myself to look at her reflection and really see her. Not as a source of fear, but as a person who might need help. I spoke to her out loud, told her I could see her, asked her what she needed from me, told her I wanted to help if I could. For a long time, nothing happened, and I started to feel foolish again, talking to an empty sleeper berth. But then I felt something, a wave of intense emotion that wasn't mine, grief and longing and desperation. And with that emotion came images, not exactly visions, but strong impressions, a sense of a car accident, of a woman dying on a highway while her family survived, of unfinished business and messages undelivered. I asked her, speaking gently, if she died in an accident, and I felt an affirmative response, not words, but a clear sense of yes. I asked if she had a message for someone, and again that affirmative sense accompanied by more impressions. A man, a husband probably, and children. and words she'd never got to say, apologies and I love yous and please take care of yourselves. I asked her name and I heard it clearly in my mind, spoken in a voice that wasn't mine. Catherine. I asked where she died and I got an impression of a highway marker, a specific mile marker in Oklahoma, on the same route I'd been driving when I first saw her. I promised Catherine that I'd try to help her, that on my next run through Oklahoma I'd stop at that location and see if I could find any information about her accident, any way to deliver her message to her family. The moment I made that promise, I felt the emotional intensity in my cab diminish. And when I looked in the mirror, Catherine was still there, but her expression had changed. Less desperate, more hopeful. She stayed with me for the next 2 weeks, appearing in my mirror whenever I was in the truck. But the oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by something almost companionable, like she was just keeping me company on the road, waiting patiently for me to fulfill my promise. When I finally made it back to Oklahoma on my next eastbound run, I exited the highway at the mile marker Catherine had shown me and found a small memorial on the side of the road. White crosses and flowers and a laminated photo, weathered by time and elements. The photo showed Catherine, looking happier and healthier than her mirror reflection, smiling with a man and 2 children. The memorial said she died 3 years ago in a single car accident, had lost control in the rain and crashed, dying at the scene while her family survived with minor injuries. There was a last name, and I used it to search online, finding an address, finding that her husband and children still lived in a town about 20 miles from the accident site. I drove to that town, to the address I'd found, my heart pounding because I had no idea how to explain this, how to tell a grieving family that their dead wife and mother had been appearing to me in my mirror. I knocked on the door and Catherine's husband answered, looking older and more tired than in the memorial photo. I introduced myself and told him as simply as I could that I'd had an experience I couldn't explain, that I believed I'd been contacted by his wife, that she had messages she wanted me to deliver. He looked at me with suspicion and pain, probably thinking I was some kind of scam artist preying on his grief. But he let me talk and I told him everything Catherine had shown me, things I couldn't have known, private things about their relationship and their life together. By the end of my account, he was crying and so was I, and he invited me inside where I met Catherine's children, now teenagers, and I delivered her messages to each of them, told them she was sorry she'd left them, told them she loved them more than anything, told them to take care of each other and to remember her happy. I don't know if I got every word exactly right, but I conveyed the emotional truth of what she'd wanted to say, and I could see the relief and healing that came from knowing she hadn't just vanished, that some part of her had persisted long enough to say goodbye properly. When I got back to my truck that evening and looked in my rearview mirror, Catherine was gone, truly gone, not just invisible but absent, and I knew she'd moved on to wherever people go when they finally let go of this world. The sleeper berth felt empty in a way it hadn't even before she'd appeared, like something that had been there had left a space that would take time to fill. I felt honored and humbled that she'd chosen me to help her, that somehow in all the millions of drivers on America's highways, I'd been the one who could see her, who could hear her, who could give her the chance to deliver the words she'd died before saying. Now when I look in my mirrors, I sometimes wonder about all the things we can't see directly, all the presences that exist just outside our normal perception, all the unfinished business that keeps spirits tied to the places they died or the people they loved. I drive more carefully now, more aware that every highway memorial represents a story, a life, a family forever changed. And I listen more carefully to those intuitive feelings, those impressions that might be dismissed as imagination, but might also be someone reaching across the barrier between living and dead, asking for help, asking to be remembered, asking for one more chance to say the things that death interrupted. Catherine taught me that the boundary between our world and whatever comes next is thinner than we think, that love and need can persist beyond death, and that sometimes all a spirit needs is someone who can see them, someone who will listen, someone who will help them finish what they started before they can finally rest. The gas station clerk with no hands from Rusty Joe name's Joe, though everyone calls me Rusty on account of the reddish tint to my graying hair and beard. And I've been driving trucks professionally for about 19 years. Ever since I got out of the Army and realized civilian life needed structure and solitude in equal measure, both of which long-haul trucking provides in abundance, I've seen my share of odd things on the road. Strange weather and strange people and the occasional strange situation that defies easy explanation, but nothing prepared me for what I encountered at a lonely gas station on Highway 95 in Nevada. An experience that still makes me check and recheck the hands of anyone who serves me. An irrational response to a very rational fear that what I saw was real and could happen again. It was summer, the kind of brutal desert summer where the temperature hits 115 by noon, and the air shimmers with heat mirages that make the road look like it's covered in water. I was hauling electronics from Los Angeles to Salt Lake City, a run that takes you through some of the most desolate landscape in the country. Long stretches where you might not see another vehicle for 30 minutes or more, where the emptiness feels less like absence and more like presence. Like the desert itself is a living thing that's watching you pass through its territory with ancient, patient eyes. I'd been driving since early morning, and by late afternoon I was running low on fuel, my gauge showing less than a quarter tank, which in the Nevada desert is enough to make any smart driver nervous. I'd been watching for fuel stops, but this section of Highway 95 is notorious for having few services, and I'd passed my last opportunity about 80 miles back, choosing to push on because I'd thought I could make it to the next major town without problems. That was a miscalculation, and now I was scanning the horizon with increasing anxiety, doing mental math about fuel consumption versus distance remaining, and coming up with numbers that weren't encouraging. That's when I saw it, maybe 5 miles ahead, a structure rising from the heat shimmer, a gas station that, according to my knowledge of this route, shouldn't have been there, but whose presence I was in no position to question. As I got closer, I could see it was an old-style station, the kind that probably dated from the 1950s or 60s, a single building with 2 pumps under a rusted metal awning. No branding visible, no signs indicating what company owned it or what services it offered. The building itself was sun-bleached and weathered, its original paint color long since faded to a uniform grayish tan that matched the desert around it. There were no other vehicles at the station, no signs of life except for an open sign hanging crooked in the window, and the whole place had an abandoned quality that made me hesitate before pulling in. But my fuel situation didn't leave room for hesitation, so I pulled up to one of the pumps and shut off my engine. The silence when my engine died was profound and unsettling. No traffic noise, no wind, no bird song or insect sounds, just a heavy quiet that pressed against my eardrums like atmospheric pressure. I climbed down from my cab and the heat hit me like a physical force, dry and intense. The kind of heat that makes breathing feel like inhaling from an oven. I approached the pump, an ancient model that I wasn't even sure would work with my fuel card, and saw a handwritten sign taped to it reading "Pay inside first" in shaky letters that looked like they'd been written by someone with an unsteady hand. I walked toward the building, my boots crunching on gravel and sand, and pushed open a glass door that protested with a squeal of unoiled hinges. Inside was cooler, but not much. A single struggling air conditioner making a grinding noise in the window, but not producing much in the way of cold air. The space was cramped and dusty, shelves lined with products that looked old, packages faded by time and sun exposure, brands I didn't recognize mixed with familiar ones that seemed slightly off, like someone had stocked the place from memory rather than from current wholesale catalogs. Behind the counter, sitting on a stool and illuminated by a fluorescent light that buzzed and flickered, was the clerk, a man who might have been anywhere from 50 to 70, wearing a stained white t-shirt and jeans, with a face that was deeply lined and tanned to the color of old leather. I greeted him, said I needed diesel, maybe 60 gallons, and he nodded slowly, his movement seeming labored, like every gesture required conscious effort. He reached toward an old mechanical register, the kind with buttons that punch down and a drawer that springs open with a bell sound, and that's when I saw his hands, or rather, where his hands should have been. His arms ended at the wrists, but instead of prosthetics or stumps, there were just attachments, tools of some kind, metal implements that looked like they'd been bolted or grafted directly onto the bone, giving him crude pincer-like appendages instead of fingers. They clicked and scraped as he manipulated the register, and I felt my stomach turn, both from revulsion and from confusion about how what I was seeing could be possible. He noticed me staring and looked up with eyes that were remarkably blue and clear in his weathered face, and he smiled slightly. Not friendly exactly, but not hostile either, just acknowledging my reaction. "Lost them in the war," he said in a raspy voice that sounded like it wasn't used often. And I didn't ask which war because the age of the implements on his arms suggested it might have been a war from before my time. Maybe even before my father's time. He told me the pump was ready, that I could fill up, and I nodded and backed out of the store quickly, unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate, wanting to complete this transaction and get back on the road as quickly as possible. I filled my tank, the pump working slowly, taking what felt like forever to deliver 60 gallons, giving me too much time to stand in that oppressive heat and think about what I'd seen, about those metal attachments where hands should be, about how they'd clicked against the register keys, about the wrongness of the whole situation. When the pump finally clicked off, I went back inside to pay, and the clerk was exactly where I'd left him, sitting on that stool, those implement hands folded in his lap like he'd been waiting patiently, like he had nothing but time. I handed him my credit card and he took it with those pincer appendages, manipulating it with surprising dexterity, sliding it through an old card reader that I was amazed still worked. While we waited for the transaction to process, a wait that seemed interminable with that ancient equipment, he spoke again, still in that raspy, unused voice. "You're wondering how I work this place," he said, and it wasn't a question. I didn't respond, didn't want to encourage conversation, but he continued anyway. "I manage. Been here 30 years, maybe more, don't keep track anymore. People stop, people stare, people leave. Nobody stays. Nobody ever stays." There was a profound loneliness in the way he said it, and despite my unease, I felt a stab of sympathy for this man, if man he was, isolated in this desert nowhere with only his clicking metal hands for company. The card reader finally beeped, and he handed me my receipt with those same implement hands, and I noticed details I'd missed before, that the metal had been worn smooth in places from decades of use, that there were scratches and dents that suggested a long history of making do, of adapting, of surviving. I thanked him, wanting to say something else, something kind or at least acknowledging his humanity, but the words stuck in my throat, and I just turned and left, my receipt crumpling in my sweating hand. I climbed back into my cab, started my engine with a flood of relief, and pulled out of that station faster than was probably safe, spraying gravel as I accelerated back onto the highway. I drove for maybe 10 miles before I thought to check my receipt, and when I did, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The station name printed at the top read Desert's End Service Station, and below that was a date stamp, but the date was wrong, off by exactly 30 years, showing a date from 1994 even though this was 2024. I looked at the credit card slip stapled to it, and the signature line where I should have signed was blank. And I realized with creeping horror that I didn't remember signing anything. Didn't remember the clerk asking me to sign. Didn't remember completing that part of the transaction. I checked my credit card statement later that week, obsessively checking every day, But there was no charge from Desert's End service station. No charge from any gas station on that date. Like the transaction had never happened. But my fuel tank was full. Undeniably full. And I had the receipt, physical proof that I'd been there, that I'd seen what I'd seen. I tried to research the station, looking for it on maps and in business directories, searching for Desert's End service station on Highway 95 in Nevada. But I found nothing, no record of it ever existing, no mention in any database. I even drove that route again a few months later, specifically looking for it, paying close attention to landmarks and mile markers, but there was nothing there, just uninterrupted desert and empty highway. I've talked to other drivers about it cautiously, not wanting to sound crazy, describing what I saw and asking if anyone else had encountered it. Most looked at me like I'd been out in the sun too long, but one older driver, a guy who'd been running that route since the 70s, got a strange look on his face and told me he'd heard stories, rumors really, about a station that appeared to drivers who were running out of fuel in the desert. A station that saved people from dangerous situations but demanded nothing in return, operated by a man who'd been there so long he'd become part of the desert itself, neither fully alive nor fully dead, just existing in that liminal space between, providing a service because it was all he knew how to do anymore. The older driver told me that according to the stories, the clerk had been a veteran, had come back from war damaged in ways both visible and invisible, had opened his station in the desert because he wanted solitude, wanted to be away from people who would stare at his injuries, wanted to exist in a place where the emptiness outside matched the emptiness inside. He died there supposedly, heart attack or old age or just giving up. But somehow he'd continued operating the station, or the desert had continued operating it through him, or the station had achieved some kind of independent existence that needed him as much as he needed it. The details were vague, contradictory, more myth than history, but the core story was consistent. A helpful ghost providing fuel to desperate travelers, asking nothing except perhaps to be acknowledged, to be seen, to be remembered. I don't know if I believe in ghosts, don't know if I believe in desert magic or places that exist outside normal time and space. But I know what I saw. I know those clicking metal hands were real. I know that fuel appeared in my tank even if my credit card company has no record of me paying for it. I carry that receipt with me, keep it in a plastic sleeve in my visor. And sometimes when I'm driving through isolated areas and my fuel gauge starts dropping toward empty, I look at it and remember the lonely clerk with his implement hands and his rasping voice. And I wonder if he's still there in his impossible station, still waiting for the next desperate driver to appear out of the heat shimmer, still providing help to people who need it without asking for anything in return, except maybe a moment of human connection, however brief, however uncomfortable. The road is full of mysteries and waypoints and services that keep us moving forward. And sometimes those services come from unexpected sources, from people or entities who exist in the margins of what's possible, who provide what we need in moments of desperation without ever explaining why or how. I was saved that day by something I can't explain, by someone who was perhaps more dedicated to helping travelers than anyone I've ever met. And if that clerk was a ghost, then he was the kindest ghost I could imagine, giving without taking, helping without judging, existing solely to make sure that people like me don't get stranded in the desert heat. I hope wherever he is, whatever state of existence he occupies, he knows that I remember him, that I'm grateful, that his 30 or 300 years of service weren't meaningless, that he made a difference in at least one driver's life, that he's not as forgotten or alone as he seemed when he said nobody ever stays. I stayed long enough to see him, to witness his dedication, and I'm staying in memory, carrying his story with me every time I drive that stretch of highway, every time I see a lonely gas station standing against the emptiness, every time I remember that help can come from the most unexpected sources if we're willing to accept it, despite our fear. The thing under the ice from. Iron Ike, They call me Iron Ike because I've got a constitution that seems unbreakable. Never get sick, never complain about the cold or heat. Just keep driving no matter what conditions the road throws at me. I've been hauling freight for 27 years, specializing in northern routes through Canada and the upper Midwest, places where winter isn't just a season, but a test of endurance that separates the competent drivers from the ones who should probably find work in warmer climates. I've driven through blizzards that reduced visibility to nothing, through temperatures that dropped so low my diesel gelled despite additives, through ice storms that turned highways into skating rinks, and I've handled all of it with the calm professionalism that comes from experience and respect for the power of winter weather. But what happened on the ice road crossing Lake Winnipeg 3 winters ago tested more than my driving skills, tested my understanding of what's possible, what's real, and what might be lurking in the frozen depths beneath roads we assume are solid and safe. The ice roads that form across Canada's frozen lakes during winter are marvels of natural engineering. Thick ice strong enough to support fully loaded transport trucks, cutting travel time and distance for remote communities that would otherwise be accessible only by air. I'd driven ice roads dozens of times before, always with appropriate caution but never with real fear, because the ice is monitored constantly, thickness measured and weight limits posted, and if you follow the rules and don't do anything stupid, they're actually quite safe. The crossing of Lake Winnipeg I was making that February night was routine, a shortcut I'd taken many times before, hauling mining equipment from Winnipeg to a site north of the lake. A crossing that would save me 4 hours compared to driving around the lake on conventional roads. I started the crossing around 9 p.m., which wasn't ideal but also wasn't unusual. The ice road lit by reflective markers along the edges and occasional light towers powered by generators. The ice was reported at 36 inches thick, more than adequate for my rig, which came in well under the posted weight limit, and the weather was clear and cold, around minus 25 Celsius. Perfect conditions for maintaining ice strength. The crossing was supposed to take about 90 minutes. A straight shot across the frozen expanse with nothing to do but maintain a steady speed and stay between the markers. Let my mind wander while my hands kept the wheel steady. About 30 minutes in, when I was well out in the middle of the lake with nothing visible in any direction except ice and stars and the distant glow of light towers, I felt something through my steering wheel. A vibration that wasn't coming from my engine or my tires, but from below, from the ice itself. It was subtle at first, barely noticeable, just a faint tremor that I might have dismissed as imagination, except that it was consistent, rhythmic almost, like a heartbeat or breathing. I slowed down slightly, thinking maybe I'd driven over a rough patch, but the vibration continued, actually seemed to get slightly stronger, and now I could hear it too. A low-frequency hum that I felt in my chest as much as heard with my ears. I'd been briefed on ice road safety, knew about the phenomenon of resonance where vehicles traveling at certain speeds can set up wave patterns in the ice that can be dangerous. So I adjusted my speed, dropping from 50 kilometers per hour down to 30, then down to 20, but the vibration didn't stop, didn't change in response to my speed variations. If anything, it was getting more pronounced, and now I was starting to feel genuinely concerned, because this didn't match any of the normal ice road conditions I'd been taught about. I grabbed my radio to call the ice road monitoring station, report what I was experiencing, ask if other drivers had mentioned anything similar. But when I keyed the mic, all I got was static, heavy and crackling, completely blocking any signal. That's when I saw the cracks, hairline fractures spreading across the ice ahead of me, visible in my headlights, spiderwebbing out from a central point roughly 50 meters in front of my position. They weren't moving toward me, weren't spreading in the dangerous rapid way that indicates ice failure, but they were there, forming a pattern that was too regular to be natural, too geometric, almost like something was pressing up from below with immense force concentrated at specific points. I hit my brakes, maybe too hard. felt my trailer start to slide on the ice before my anti-lock system caught and helped me regain control. And I came to a stop about 20 meters from where those cracks converged. My heart pounding, my breath coming in short gasps that fogged the inside of my windshield. The vibration stopped the moment I stopped moving, cut off so abruptly that the silence afterward was shocking, and I sat there in my idling truck trying to decide what to do. I could reverse, back up, and try to find another route across the ice, but I was in the middle of a marked road and leaving it risked driving onto thinner ice or into areas with pressure ridges. I could try to drive around the cracked area, but that had the same risks. Or I could proceed forward slowly, hoping that the cracks were superficial, that the ice beneath was still solid, that whatever had caused them wasn't actually a threat to my crossing. I was still weighing these options when the ice began to glow, a pale blue-green luminescence emanating from beneath the surface, centered on the area where the cracks converged, growing brighter with each passing second. I've seen ice glow before, seen the way headlights can penetrate into clear ice and create beautiful effects, but this was different. This light was coming from below the ice, from deep in the water beneath, rising up like something was ascending from the lake bottom. The light was bright enough now that I could see clearly without my headlights, bright enough that I could see the ice thickness and the way the cracks went deeper than I'd initially thought. Not just surface fractures, but fissures that penetrated at least a foot down into the ice. And in the center of that glowing area, something was moving. Something large. Something that was displacing water and pushing against the ice from beneath. Something that shouldn't exist in a frozen lake in the middle of winter. I saw it clearly then. Visible through the ice despite the distortion of looking through 36 inches of frozen water. A shape that my brain struggled to interpret. Too large to be a fish, too purposeful in its movements to be debris or ice chunks. It was dark against the glowing water, massive with what looked like tentacles or appendages, dozens of them, radiating out from a central body mass that must have been at least the size of a small car. The appendages were pressing against the underside of the ice, testing it, probing it, and I realized with horror that those cracks I'd seen were caused by this thing. By its attempts to break through, to reach the surface, to reach me. One of the appendages found a crack and began to work at it, widening it, and I watched frozen in terror as a piece of ice the size of a dinner plate lifted up, pushed from below by something dark and glistening, that briefly emerged into the air before the cold hit it and it withdrew, but not before I saw enough detail to know that this was biological. Living tissue, something alive and aware and purposeful. The glowing intensified and more appendages began working at the cracks, and I snapped out of my paralysis and threw my truck into gear, pressing on the accelerator, deciding that forward was my only option, that I had to get past this area before whatever was below managed to break through completely. My truck lurched forward, tires fighting for traction on the smooth ice, and I steered around the worst of the cracks, driving half on the ice road and half off it, not caring about protocol or safety margins, just focused on getting away from that glowing area and whatever was beneath it. I heard cracking sounds, loud reports like gunshots, and in my mirrors I could see the ice I'd just driven over heaving upward, large sections lifting and breaking, water surging up through widening gaps. Something breached the surface behind me. I saw it in my mirror, a glimpse of something impossible, something that belonged in ocean depths or in nightmares, not in a frozen Canadian lake. Multiple appendages waving in the frigid air before cold and physics pulled them back down. I drove faster than was safe on ice, pushed my speed up to 70 kilometers per hour, risking my truck and my life, but more afraid of what was behind me than what was ahead. The glow was fading in my mirrors, the thing apparently unable or unwilling to follow. And after maybe 5 minutes of flat-out driving, I reached an area where the ice felt solid again, where there were no cracks or vibrations or unnatural lights. I didn't slow down, didn't stop, just kept driving until I reached the far shore and felt my tires hit blessed solid ground that wasn't floating on water that contained impossible things. I pulled into the first parking area I found, killed my engine and sat there shaking for probably 20 minutes, my mind trying to process what I'd seen, trying to find rational explanations and failing completely. When I finally trusted my legs to support me, I got out and examined my truck looking for damage and found nothing. No cracks in my trailer, no issues with my tires or suspension. It's like I'd driven across perfectly normal ice rather than over something's attempt to break through from below. I checked my mirrors and saw that the area I'd crossed was dark again. No glow visible, and I wondered if it had all been some kind of hallucination, exhaustion-induced psychosis, carbon monoxide leak in my cab affecting my perception. But I knew it was real, knew what I'd seen, and when I reported to the ice road monitoring station, I told them everything, expecting disbelief or mockery, but instead getting grim acknowledgement. The supervisor I spoke with said they'd send a crew out to check the ice in that area. And then he asked me if the thing I'd seen had multiple long appendages, if the glow had been blue-green, if the vibration had felt like a heartbeat. When I confirmed all of that, he nodded slowly and told me I wasn't the first to report something like this. That over the years they'd had multiple incidents of drivers encountering something in that general area. Something that seemed to be territorial or curious, or maybe just aware that the ice roads represented intrusion into its domain. He told me, speaking quietly like he didn't want anyone else to hear, that Lake Winnipeg is deeper than most people realize, that it has pockets and trenches that go down hundreds of feet, that it's connected to underground water systems and river networks, that anything could be living in its depths and we'd never know unless it chose to make itself known. He said the local indigenous communities have stories going back centuries about lake creatures, water spirits, things that live in the cold depths and occasionally interact with the surface world, usually during winter when the ice forms and creates a barrier they can test, can probe, can try to breach. He said most of those stories were dismissed as folklore or misidentification of natural phenomena. But drivers like me who'd seen it firsthand knew better. Knew that the stories were based on real encounters with real creatures that science hadn't cataloged or acknowledged. I asked him what I should do, whether I should report it to wildlife authorities or research institutions. And he laughed bitterly and told me that reports had been made dozens of times over the years and always dismissed. That without clear photographic or video evidence, nobody wanted to acknowledge the possibility of large, unidentified creatures in Canadian lakes. That it was easier to assume drivers were hallucinating or lying than to accept that our understanding of freshwater ecosystems might be incomplete. He advised me to just put it behind me, continue driving the ice roads if I felt comfortable doing so, avoid that particular area if possible, and remember that we share this world with things we don't fully understand, things that were here long before us and will probably be here long after we're gone. I took his advice mostly, continued driving northern routes, but I've never crossed Lake Winnipeg on the ice roads again. Always take the long way around no matter how much time it costs me. Other drivers have asked me why, and I give vague answers about preferring land routes or not trusting ice roads as much as I used to. But the real reason is that I can't forget what I saw under the ice. Can't forget those appendages pressing against the barrier between its world and mine. Can't forget the intelligence I sensed in the way it tested the ice, methodically looking for weak points, learning about the obstacles in its environment. I wonder sometimes what it would have done if it had broken through completely. If it would have attacked my truck or just examined it with alien curiosity before sinking back into the depths. And I'm glad I didn't wait around to find out. The ice roads are essential infrastructure for northern communities. Vital economic lifelines that make remote living viable, but they're also temporary invasions of territory that doesn't really belong to us. Frozen bridges across the domains of creatures that live in perpetual cold and darkness. We drive across their ceilings, rumbling overhead with our loads of supplies and equipment, and mostly they ignore us or don't notice us. But sometimes one takes interest, comes up to investigate, reminds us that the ice is thinner than we think, and the water below contains mysteries we're not equipped to handle. I respect the ice roads now in a different way, not just as engineering challenges or weather-dependent routes, but as borders between worlds. Places where the familiar and the unknown press against each other with only frozen water as separation. And I drive carefully, respectfully, aware that every crossing is a privilege granted by forces we don't control, aware that the thing under the ice is still there, still watching, still waiting for the day when maybe the ice isn't quite thick enough, or a truck is quite heavy enough, and it gets another chance to break through and explore the world above its perpetual darkness. I just hope I'm nowhere nearby when that day comes. Hope I'm on solid ground somewhere warm, telling stories to younger drivers who'll probably dismiss them as the exaggerations of an old man who's been on the road too long. Never knowing that every word is true and that beneath the ice, something ancient and impossible is waiting, patient and persistent, for its opportunity. The passenger who left a bloody handprint from Freightliner. Frank name's Frank. Been driving Freightliner trucks for most of my adult life. Hence the handle Freightliner Frank that other drivers use on the CB. And I take a certain pride in knowing my equipment, keeping my rig clean and well maintained, treating it with the respect that a machine deserves when your life and livelihood depend on its reliable operation. I've always had a policy of never picking up hitchhikers, not because I'm unsympathetic to people who need help, but because the liability and safety risks just aren't worth it. Too many stories of things going wrong, of drivers being robbed or worse by people they tried to help. That policy served me well for 18 years, kept me safe and out of trouble, right up until the night I broke it for reasons I still don't fully understand. The night I picked up a passenger who left more than just memories behind when he departed. It was late October, and I was driving through Pennsylvania on Interstate 80, hauling auto parts from Detroit to Newark, a routine run I'd made probably 50 times without incident. The weather was miserable, cold rain mixed with sleet, the kind of weather that makes driving exhausting because you're constantly fighting limited visibility and slick roads. Your attention divided between watching for other vehicles and watching for ice forming on overpasses. It was around 2 in the morning, that dead zone where most of the world is sleeping, and the highway belongs to us long haul, drivers and the occasional insomniac making their way somewhere, urgent. I came around a long curve and my headlights caught a figure standing on the shoulder, thumb out in the universal hitchhiker's gesture, and I started to pass without slowing because of my policy. But something made me look again in my mirror, made me see that the figure was soaking wet and shivering violently, made me notice that there was blood on his shirt, dark stains visible even in the poor lighting. Against my better judgment, against every rule I'd set for myself, I found myself slowing down, pulling onto the shoulder, stopping my rig maybe 50 feet past where he stood. I watched in my mirror as he jogged up to my truck, and I unlocked the passenger door and leaned over to open it. He climbed in with visible relief, bringing with him the smell of rain and something else, something metallic and organic that I recognized as blood. He was maybe 35, with dark hair plastered to his skull by rain, wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that had once been red and white checked but was now mostly just red, from what appeared to be significant blood staining. He was pale, shaking from cold or shock or both, and when he spoke his voice was weak and thready. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you so much." I didn't think anyone would stop. I've been out there for hours. I asked him if he was okay, if he needed medical attention, pointing at the blood on his shirt, and he looked down at himself like he'd forgotten about it, then shook his head. "Car accident," he said. "Few miles back, my girlfriend, she didn't make it. I tried to get help, but my phone's dead and there's no signal out here anyway." I asked him why he hadn't stayed with the vehicle, told him that's what you're supposed to do after an accident, wait for help to find you. And he said the car had gone off the road into a ravine, said it was too cold to wait, said he'd panicked and just started walking trying to find help. It made a kind of sense, the logic of someone in shock, someone not thinking clearly. and I told him we'd get him to a hospital, get him checked out, report the accident so emergency services could go look for his girlfriend, even though from the way he'd said she didn't make it, I suspected they'd be recovering a body rather than rescuing a survivor. He nodded and sat back in the passenger seat, pulling the seatbelt across his chest with hands that were shaking so badly he had trouble clicking it into place. I got back on the highway and started watching for the next exit with services, planning to stop at the first place I found and call 911 to report both the accident and the injured passenger I'd picked up. My passenger was quiet, staring out the windshield at the rain-slicked highway, occasionally shivering despite the heat I'd cranked up to maximum, trying to help him get warm. I tried to make conversation, asked him his name, where he'd been heading, trying to keep him alert because I'd heard that people in shock sometimes go to sleep and don't wake up. He told me his name was Michael, that he and his girlfriend had been driving from Pittsburgh to visit family in New York, that they'd hit a patch of black ice on a curve and the car had just kept going straight, through the guardrail and down the embankment into the trees. He described the crash in detail that seemed too vivid, too precise for someone who should have been disoriented from trauma, talked about the sound of metal tearing, the sensation of weightlessness as the car went airborne, the way his girlfriend had screamed until the moment of impact cut off her voice. He said he'd tried to help her, tried to get her out of the wreckage, but she'd been pinned by the steering column, crushed in ways that made it clear she was beyond help. He'd stayed with her until she stopped breathing, held her hand while her life drained away, then forced himself to leave, to go find help even though help was too late for her, walking through woods and climbing up to the highway where he'd stood in the rain waiting for someone to stop. As he talked, I noticed he was leaving wet marks on my passenger seat, not just from rain but something darker, and I realized he was bleeding actively, that whatever injuries he'd sustained in the crash were worse than I'd initially thought. I told him I was taking him to a hospital now immediately, not waiting for the next planned stop but getting off at the very next exit, regardless of what services it had. He nodded but didn't seem particularly concerned about his injuries, just kept talking about the accident, about his girlfriend, about how he should have been driving instead of her, about how if he'd been behind the wheel, maybe his reflexes would have been quicker, maybe he would have controlled the skid, maybe she'd still be alive. We reached an exit and I took it, following signs for a hospital that I hoped was close. And that's when things started getting strange in ways I couldn't ignore. Michael's voice was getting weaker, his words beginning to slur together, and when I glanced over at him I saw that his skin had taken on a grayish cast, that his lips were blue, that he looked worse than anyone I'd ever seen who was still conscious and talking. I urged him to hang on, told him we were almost there, and he looked at me with eyes that seemed to have trouble focusing and said something that made my blood run cold. "I'm already gone," he said quietly. "Been gone since the moment of impact. I just didn't want to be alone at the end. Didn't want to die alone in that car in the dark." Before I could respond, before I could process what he'd just said, we pulled into the hospital emergency entrance and I started to tell him we'd made it. Help was here, but when I turned to look at him, the passenger seat was empty. Completely empty. No Michael, no wet marks, no blood stains, just my clean passenger seat exactly as it had been before I'd stopped to pick him up. I sat there in stunned disbelief, my mind refusing to accept what my eyes were showing me. And I actually reached over to touch the seat, to confirm it was real. And my hand came away wet with something dark and sticky that in the harsh lights of the hospital entrance was unmistakably blood. And there on the back of the seat was a handprint, palm and 5 fingers clearly visible in dark crimson, pressed into the fabric like someone had grabbed the seat back for support. I stumbled out of my truck and into the emergency room, my heart racing, my mind reeling, and I tried to explain to the nurse at the desk what had happened, that I'd picked up an accident victim who'd disappeared from my truck, that there was an accident somewhere on Interstate 80, that needed emergency response. She looked at me with professional concern and asked for details. Location, time, and I realized I didn't have concrete information. Just Michael's vague description of going off the road a few miles before where I'd picked him up. She said she'd passed the information to state police, but her expression suggested she thought I was either confused or possibly intoxicated, and I didn't blame her because my story sounded insane even to me. I went back to my truck and examined the passenger seat more carefully, photographing the handprint with my phone because I needed evidence that I wasn't losing my mind, that something had actually happened. The handprint was clear and detailed, too anatomically precise to be anything except a real human hand pressed against the fabric, with enough force and enough blood to leave a perfect impression. I sat in my truck for a long time trying to decide what to do, whether to continue my delivery or turn around and try to find the accident site Michael had described, whether to involve police more formally, or just try to forget the whole thing. Ultimately, I called the Pennsylvania State Police non-emergency line and filed a detailed report, gave them the approximate location based on where I'd picked Michael up, described the car accident he told me about, asked them to check the area for a vehicle that had gone off the road. The dispatcher took my information with professional courtesy, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice. The assumption that I'd probably seen someone who'd wandered away from an accident and was now safe at home. That the dramatic aspects of my story were exaggerations or misunderstandings. She said they'd send a unit to check the area and would contact me if they found anything. They called me back 6 hours later, after I'd completed my delivery and was trying to rest at a truck stop, my mind too agitated for sleep. A different voice, more serious, identifying himself as a detective, asking me detailed questions about Michael, about his appearance, about what he'd told me. Then he informed me that they'd found the accident site, exactly where Michael had described it, a Honda Civic at the bottom of a 40-foot ravine, and inside they'd found a deceased female, killed on impact from the looks of it, and also a deceased male who matched my description of Michael, also dead on impact. Both victims appearing to have died instantly when the vehicle struck the trees at the bottom of the ravine. The detective said the crash had likely occurred around midnight, based on when the victims' last cell phone activity had been recorded, meaning both of them had been dead for at least 2 hours before I claimed to have picked Michael up on the highway. I tried to explain that I knew what I'd experienced, that Michael had been in my truck, had talked to me, had bled on my seat, but the detective suggested gently that I'd probably seen someone else, someone who'd discovered the accident and was also seeking help, someone who happened to match my description of the deceased. He thanked me for the report because it had helped them locate the crash site, but his tone made it clear he thought the supernatural aspects of my story were either fabrications or the result of a tired driver's overactive imagination. I didn't argue, just thanked him for the information and hung up, staring at my phone and wondering if I was crazy, if I'd hallucinated the whole thing. But I had the photograph of the handprint, and over the following days I had that handprint analyzed by 3 different people: a forensic technician I knew from a previous incident, a biology professor at a community college who owed me a favor, and a professional crime scene cleaner who'd seen more blood than anyone should have to see. All 3 confirmed the same thing. The handprint was real human blood, type O negative to be specific, and the print showed ridge detail consistent with a real palm and fingers, not a stamp or fake impression. The forensic technician even managed to pull a partial fingerprint from the image, and when I asked the detective if he could compare it to Michael's fingerprints from the accident, he reluctantly agreed and came back shaken because it was a match, a definitive match to the right hand of the deceased male from the Honda Civic. That confirmation should have given me closure, but instead it just opened up more questions. Questions about what I'd really experienced, about whether Michael had somehow lingered after death long enough to seek help or company, about whether the boundary between life and death is more permeable than we want to believe. I've tried to make sense of it using every framework I can think of. Scientific, spiritual, psychological, and none of them fully explain what happened that night. How a dead man managed to be solid enough to sit in my truck and bleed on my seat. How he could talk and move and interact with the physical world despite being gone. I had the passenger seat professionally cleaned, but I could never quite get rid of the stain completely. And eventually I just replaced the entire seat because I couldn't stand looking at that spot where Michael had sat, where he'd left his mark in more ways than one. I still drive Interstate 80 occasionally, and I still see hitchhikers sometimes, but I never stop anymore. Not even for people who look desperate or injured, because I learned that helping people comes with risks that go beyond the physical, that sometimes you invite things into your space that leave permanent marks on more than just your upholstery. Michael needed someone in his final moments, even if those moments came after his actual death. Needed not to be alone. Needed to tell his story to someone who would listen and maybe remember him. I gave him that. And while I'm glad I could provide that comfort, I also recognize that the cost was my peace of mind, my certainty about the nature of reality, my ability to trust my own perceptions. The handprint is gone from my truck, but it's burned into my memory. A reminder that the road is haunted not just by the living, but by the recently departed, by those who aren't quite ready to let go, who need one more interaction, one more moment of human connection before they can accept the finality of their death and move on to whatever comes next. The road sign that changed. Every mile from outlaw. Owen, they call me outlaw. Owen not because I break laws, but because I used to run with a motorcycle club before I got my CDL and settled into the more stable life of truck driving. And the name just stuck, following me from that previous life into this new one. I've been driving trucks for about 14 years now, and I pride myself on knowing roads, really knowing them, not just in terms of which route gets you from point A to point B fastest, but in terms of the character of roads, the personality they develop from the traffic that uses them, and the landscape they cross and the history they've accumulated over years or decades or centuries of existence. That intimate knowledge of roads is what made my experience on State Route 41 in Wisconsin so profoundly disorienting, because it involved a road I thought I knew becoming something unfamiliar, something that changed its nature with every mile I drove, something that seemed to be actively communicating with me through the one medium roads have, their signs. I was running a load of furniture from Milwaukee to Minneapolis, taking State Route 41 north because I preferred it to the interstate. Liked the smaller towns and the more interesting scenery, even if it added a little time to the trip. It was late September, that perfect fall weather where the trees are starting to turn colors and the air has that crisp quality that makes you feel alert and alive. I'd left Milwaukee around 6 in the evening, planning to drive through the night and arrive in Minneapolis by dawn, grab breakfast, and then catch a few hours of sleep before my scheduled delivery time. The first hour of the drive was completely normal, exactly what I expected from a route I'd driven probably 20 times before, familiar landmarks passing at familiar intervals, the road behaving exactly as a road should. Around 7:30, just as the sun was setting and I was entering a stretch of highway that ran through state forest land, I passed a standard green highway sign indicating the next town and its distance, Oak Ridge, 32 miles. I noted it automatically, the way drivers do, filing the information away for planning purposes, knowing I'd probably stop in Oak Ridge to stretch my legs and grab coffee. But then, maybe 10 minutes later, and certainly not 32 miles later, I passed another sign, and this one read Oak Ridge in 45 miles. I did a double take. Confused because distances to towns should decrease as you approach them, not increase, and I wondered if there were two different Oak Ridges in this area. One closer and one farther, though that seemed unlikely. I kept driving, paying more attention to the signs now, and 5 miles later I passed another Oak Ridge sign reading Oak Ridge 18 miles. The inconsistency bothered me, suggested either that the highway department had made errors in sign placement or that my memory of the previous signs was faulty, and I started watching more carefully, making mental notes of each sign I passed. The next one, maybe 7 miles farther, read Oak Ridge 9 miles, which made sense based on the previous sign, but then 3 miles after that I passed one reading Oak Ridge 67 miles, which made no sense at all unless I'd somehow gotten turned around and was driving back the way I'd come, which I definitely wasn't because the sun was setting ahead and to my left, exactly where it should be for northbound travel at this time of year. I checked my GPS, and it showed me on State Route 41 heading north, my position updating normally. No indication that anything was wrong with my navigation or location, but the signs kept contradicting themselves, kept giving distances that didn't follow any logical progression, and I started to feel a creeping unease that something was very wrong with this situation. The next sign I passed didn't show a distance at all. Just read Oak Ridge soon in the same official green and white formatting as all the other signs, and that deviation from standard sign wording sent a chill down my spine because highway signs don't use subjective terms like soon. They use precise measurements because precision is essential for navigation and planning. As full darkness fell and my headlights became my primary source of visibility, the signs started changing in other ways. The distances becoming increasingly bizarre, sometimes showing negative numbers like Oak Ridge minus 14 miles, sometimes showing impossible numbers like Oak Ridge infinity miles, sometimes showing numbers that weren't numbers at all but symbols or equations or what looked like coordinates. One sign read Oak Ridge 1 miles, which any high school math student would recognize as an imaginary number, and I started to wonder if I was hallucinating, if carbon monoxide was leaking into my cab, if I'd somehow ingested something that was causing me to see things that weren't there. But the signs were real, solid, illuminated by my headlights with the reflective material that makes highway signs visible at night. And when I stopped and got out to examine one up close, it was definitely real, definitely physical, cold metal mounted on a standard signpost. The sign I'd stopped at read Oak Ridge, when you arrive you'll know, and below that in smaller letters, keep driving Owen. The fact that it used my name, that it addressed me personally, was so shocking that I actually took several steps back from the sign, my heart racing. Because highway signs don't know drivers' names. Highway signs don't personalize their messages. Highway signs are impersonal infrastructure that serves all travelers equally. I got back in my truck and sat there for several minutes trying to decide what to do, whether to continue forward or turn back, whether to report this to someone or keep it to myself. The rational part of my brain was screaming that something was very wrong, that roads don't behave this way, that signs don't personalize themselves, that I should get off this route immediately and find an alternative way to Minneapolis. But another part of me, the part that had earned me the outlaw nickname, was curious, wanted to see where this led, wanted to understand what was happening and why it was happening to me specifically. I decided to continue, partly out of curiosity and partly because turning back felt like giving up, like admitting defeat to whatever force or entity was manipulating these signs. I drove on, and the signs continued their impossible progression, each one different from the last, each one providing information that was technically about Oak Ridge, but conveyed more than just distance. One sign read, Oak Ridge, where you lost your father, which hit me like a physical blow because my father had died 8 years earlier, and I'd been driving through Wisconsin when I'd gotten the call, though I couldn't remember the exact location. Another sign read, Oak Ridge, where choices have consequences, and another Oak Ridge, the town that remembers what you've forgotten. The signs were telling a story, or maybe they were asking questions, or maybe they were just reflecting things from my subconscious. Anxieties and memories and fears given physical form through some mechanism I didn't understand. I passed a sign reading "Oak Ridge, stop running," and realized with uncomfortable clarity that I had been running, not physically but emotionally, using the road as an escape from obligations and relationships and emotional complexity, staying in motion. Because motion meant I didn't have to face the things that stood still and waited for resolution. I'd left the motorcycle club, left that life, but I hadn't really stopped being an outlaw, hadn't really committed to anything or anyone, just kept driving, kept moving, kept telling myself that the next town, the next load, the next mile would somehow provide what I was looking for. Then I crested a hill and saw lights in the valley below. A small town that, according to my GPS, was indeed Oak Ridge. My destination finally reached despite the impossible progression of signs that had led me here. I drove down into the town and it looked completely normal. A typical Wisconsin small town with a main street, a few stores, a couple of churches, a population of maybe 2,000 based on the welcome sign at the town limits. I pulled into a gas station, filled my truck, went inside to pay and asked the clerk if he'd noticed anything strange about the highway signs leading into town. He looked at me blankly and said the signs were fine as far as he knew. Hadn't heard any complaints, and I realized that whatever I'd experienced had been unique to me, visible only to me. A personal journey disguised as a navigation error. I continued to Minneapolis without incident, completed my delivery, but I couldn't stop thinking about those signs, about what they'd shown me, about the message they seemed to be conveying. Over the next few weeks, I did some research, looked into the history of State Route 41, searched for reports of other drivers experiencing strange signs or unusual phenomena. I found a few stories, vague accounts of roads that seemed longer than they should be, signs that gave conflicting information, drivers feeling like they'd driven in circles despite GPS evidence to the contrary, but nothing that exactly matched my experience of signs that told personal truths disguised as distance measurements. I talked to a friend who was into mysticism and paranormal stuff, described what had happened, and she suggested that maybe I'd experienced what she called a teaching road, a place where the boundary between physical and spiritual was thin enough that the universe or consciousness, or whatever you want to call it, could use the familiar language of roads and signs to communicate truths that needed to be heard. She said indigenous cultures have stories of sacred paths that teach those who walk them, that challenge travelers with visions or tests or revelations, that force people to confront things they've been avoiding. Maybe State Route 41 through that section of Wisconsin was one of those places. Maybe it had a message specifically for me, and maybe I'd been ready, consciously or not, to receive that message. I've driven that route several times since, always curious about whether the experience would repeat, whether the signs would again transform into personal messages. They haven't. They've remained normal highway signs showing normal distances and normal information, but I drive differently now, more mindfully, more aware that roads are more than just pavement and painted lines, that they're stories and histories and the accumulated energy of every traveler who's passed along them. I'm not running anymore, or at least I'm trying not to run, trying to actually be present in my life rather than just passing through it at 65 miles per hour. And while I can't prove that those impossible signs were real, or that they were anything more than a very specific hallucination, I know they changed me, shifted something in my perspective that needed shifting. Maybe that's what roads are really for. Not just transportation, but transformation. Not just getting from here to there, but becoming someone different in the process of the journey. The signs on State Route 41 told me I was heading toward Oak Ridge, but they were really telling me I was heading toward a reckoning with myself, toward a moment where I'd have to acknowledge what I'd been avoiding and decide whether to continue running or finally stop and deal with the things that scared me about commitment and permanence and being truly known by another person. I stopped running, made changes in my life, reached out to people I'd been keeping at arm's length. And while it wasn't easy and it's still a work in progress, I'm different now than I was before those signs, more rooted, less restless. Though I still love the road and still drive for a living, because some things are too much a part of you to ever fully leave behind. The difference is that now when I drive, I'm not escaping, I'm just working, just doing a job I'm good at. And when I reach my destination, I can stop and be present, rather than immediately planning the next departure. The road sign that changed every mile taught me that sometimes you have to stop measuring distance to destinations and start paying attention to the journey itself, to what you're learning and becoming with each mile you travel, to the messages that appear when you're ready to see them, even if they come in unexpected forms, even if they use the language of highway signs to deliver truths that have nothing to do with navigation and everything to do with how you're navigating your life. The voice in my CB that Saeed, don't look back from Big Rig. Bill, my name's Bill, but everyone on the road knows me as Big Rig Bill on account of the fact that I exclusively drive the biggest legal configurations. Those full 53-foot trailers loaded to the maximum 80,000-pound gross weight. The kind of rigs that take skill and experience to handle properly and command respect from other drivers who understand the physics involved in stopping and maneuvering that much mass. I've been driving professionally for 31 years. Started when I was 22 years old and never looked back, never wanted to do anything else. Found my calling on America's highways in a way that some people find religion or art or love. The CB radio has been my constant companion through all those years. My connection to the community of drivers, my source of traffic information and weather updates, and the casual camaraderie that makes long, lonely hours pass more quickly. I thought I knew everything there was to know about CB communication. All the protocols and etiquette and the personalities of regular drivers who use the same routes I do. But what happened on Highway 50 in Nevada 2 years ago taught me that CB radios can carry more than just human voices, can connect to frequencies that shouldn't exist and deliver messages from sources that aren't sitting in other trucks on the same highway. Was running a load of industrial equipment from Sacramento to Salt Lake City, taking Highway 50 through Nevada because I preferred the scenery and the lighter traffic compared to Interstate 80, even though it added some time and miles to the trip. Highway 50 has the distinction of being called the loneliest road in America, a designation that's well earned given the vast stretches of nothing between the small towns that dot the route, places where you can drive for an hour without seeing another vehicle, where the landscape is so empty and unchanging that you start to feel like you're not moving at all, like you're on a treadmill with a painted backdrop rather than actually covering distance. It was early March and I'd left Sacramento around noon, planning to drive straight through and arrive in Salt Lake City by morning. A trip of about 11 or 12 hours depending on conditions and stops. The first few hours were uneventful, exactly what I expected from this route. Long empty stretches punctuated by occasional small towns where I'd see a few cars or maybe another truck, but mostly just me and the road and the high desert landscape that stretched to distant mountains in every direction. My CB was quiet, which wasn't unusual for this highway. Occasional chatter from other drivers, but nothing sustained. Everyone focused on their own journeys through this lonely expanse. Around 5 in the afternoon, as the sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon and the light was taking on that golden quality that photographers love, I heard a voice on the CB that made me immediately pay attention. Not because of what it said initially, but because of how it sounded. Clear and strong with no static or interference despite the remote location and the distances involved in CB transmission. Big Rig Bill, the voice said, and I was startled because it used my handle, which could be coincidence since someone might have heard me use it earlier. But there was something about the way it was said, with familiarity, like the speaker knew me personally. I keyed my mic and responded, asked who was calling and what their 20 was using the CB slang for location, and the voice came back immediately. "This is Overwatch," it said, which wasn't a handle I recognized from my years on this route. And my 20 is everywhere and nowhere. And I'm calling to give you a warning, Bill. Something you need to hear and need to follow exactly if you want to make it to Salt Lake City alive. The dramatic phrasing should have made me dismiss this as some bored driver messing around, playing games to pass time on an empty highway. But there was a quality to the voice, a seriousness and urgency that made me take it seriously despite my skepticism. I asked what the warning was, and Overwatch said, "In approximately 40 miles, you're going to see something in your mirrors. Something following you. And when you see it, you're going to want to look back. Want to turn around and look directly at it. Want to stop and investigate. Don't look back, don't slow down, don't stop, don't acknowledge it in any way. Just keep driving, keep your eyes forward, and it will pass. If you look back, if you engage with it, you won't reach your destination. Do you understand?" I told Overwatch that I understood, but that this sounded like nonsense. Like a prank or maybe someone having a mental health episode, and I asked for clarification. Asked what exactly I was supposed to be watching for. The voice came back patient but firm. "You'll know it when you see it, Bill. It's different for everyone, shows each driver something specific, something designed to make them look back. For you, based on what I'm seeing, it's going to be your daughter. You're going to see your daughter in your mirrors, standing on the side of the road, and every instinct you have is going to tell you to stop and help her. Don't. She's safe at home in Reno. You can call her after you get through this. But what you see in your mirrors won't be her. Won't be anything real. Just a lure designed to make you stop." That mention of my daughter, the fact that Overwatch knew I had a daughter and knew she lived in Reno, sent a chill through me because that was specific personal information, not something a random driver would know. I asked Overwatch how they knew about my daughter, who they really were, but I got no response. Just static on the CB, and after several minutes of trying to raise them again, I gave up and continued driving, now hyper-aware and anxious, watching my mirrors with a mixture of dread and disbelief. Part of me thought this was all ridiculous, that I'd been the victim of an elaborate prank by someone who'd somehow researched my personal information. But another part of me, the part that had been driving long enough to know that roads can be strange places where normal rules don't always apply, was taking the warning seriously. The miles passed slowly, 35, 36, 37, each one making me more tense, more certain that something was about to happen even though I didn't really believe it would. Then at almost exactly 40 miles from where I'd received the warning, I saw her in my driver's side mirror, my daughter Emma, standing on the shoulder of the highway, wearing the blue jacket I'd bought her for her birthday last year, waving at me with both arms over her head, clearly trying to get my attention. My heart nearly stopped, my foot automatically moving toward the brake pedal, my mind flooding with panic because what the hell was Emma doing out here in the middle of nowhere? How had she gotten here? Was she in trouble? Did she need help? But Overwatch's warning echoed in my mind, the specific prediction that I'd see my daughter, and I forced my foot away from the brake, forced myself to keep driving even as every parental instinct I possessed was screaming at me to stop and help my child. I watched in my mirror as the figure that looked like Emma receded, still waving, and I could see her face clearly enough to recognize features, the shape of her nose, her hair color, details that shouldn't have been visible at that distance and in that lighting, but were crystal clear anyway. She started running after my truck, moving impossibly fast, keeping pace with me even though I was doing 65 miles per hour. And I realized with sick certainty that this was exactly what Overwatch had warned me about. Something that wore my daughter's appearance but wasn't her, something using the strongest emotional lever it could find to make me stop. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and called Emma's number, praying she'd answer, needing to confirm that she was safe and that what I was seeing in my mirror was indeed not her. She picked up after 3 rings, sounding sleepy, and I asked where she was, what she was doing, and she said she was at home, had been napping, asked why I sounded so weird. Relief flooded through me, confirmation that she was safe, that what was chasing my truck wasn't my daughter, and I told her everything was fine. I just wanted to hear her voice, and I'd call her later when I reached my destination. She said okay, but sounded concerned. Made me promise I was all right, and I promised and hung up, looking back at my mirror to see that the Emma thing was still there, still running, but now its face was changing, becoming less human, features shifting into something that was using my daughter's appearance like a mask, but couldn't maintain the illusion perfectly while in motion. The thing chased me for maybe 10 more miles, its appearance deteriorating with each mile, until it looked only vaguely human, a shape that suggested a person but was clearly something else, something that moved wrong with too many joints or joints that bent in wrong directions. Then it fell back, grew smaller in my mirrors, and finally vanished completely, either giving up the chase or returning to wherever it had come from. I was shaking, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles were white, my breath coming in gasps like I'd been running instead of sitting in my cab, and I felt simultaneously terrified by what I'd seen and grateful that Overwatch had warned me, had given me the information I needed to resist the temptation to stop. I tried calling Overwatch on the CB, thanking them, asking for more information about what I'd just encountered, but I got no response, just the normal quiet of Highway 50 with no traffic and no chatter. I drove on through the evening and into the night, completing my trip to Salt Lake City without further incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened, about the thing that had worn my daughter's face, about the mysterious voice that had warned me just in time. I did research when I reached Salt Lake City, searching online for information about Highway 50 phenomena, about entities that appear to drivers, about anything that might explain what I'd experienced. I found scattered reports, nothing organized or official, just forum posts and blog entries from drivers who'd had strange experiences on that highway, seen things that shouldn't exist, encountered entities that seemed designed to make them stop or leave the road. Several mentioned seeing loved ones, family members or friends who beckoned from the roadside, and those who'd stopped to investigate had experienced missing time, had found themselves hours later with no memory of what had happened. Their trucks moved to different locations with no explanation of how they'd gotten there. A few drivers had never been found, their trucks discovered abandoned on the roadside with no signs of the driver, no indication of where they'd gone or what had happened to them. The pattern suggested something predatory, something that used the psychology of human attachment and concern to lure drivers into stopping, into making themselves vulnerable, into engaging with something that existed in the margins of our world and needed that engagement, that acknowledgement, to fully interact with victims. The warning from Overwatch had saved me from becoming another statistic, another missing driver whose truck was found empty on the loneliest road in America. But who or what was Overwatch? I'd tried to research that handle, asked other drivers if they'd heard of it, searched CB logs and trucker forums and found nothing. No record of anyone using that call sign, no other drivers who'd received similar warnings. The most unsettling theory I encountered, presented in a late-night conversation with an old-timer driver who'd been running Highway 50 for 40 years, was that Overwatch wasn't a person at all, but something else. Maybe a guardian entity, or the consciousness of the road itself, or the collective awareness of all the drivers who'd traveled that highway, manifesting to protect those who were in danger. He said some roads, particularly old roads or roads that cross significant landscape features, or roads where many people have died, develop a kind of sentience not conscious in the way humans are conscious but aware in their own way, responsive to the travelers who use them, sometimes protective and sometimes hostile depending on factors nobody fully understands. Whether that theory is true or not, I can't say, but I know that something warned me. Something knew my name and my situation. Something understood what was about to happen and cared enough to intervene. I've driven Highway 50 many times since, always alert, always watching my mirrors, always ready to ignore anything unusual I might see. But I've never encountered that entity again, and I've never heard from Overwatch on my CB. Maybe it was a one-time warning for a one-time threat, or maybe I'm just lucky, or maybe having been warned once I'm now protected in some way, marked as someone who knows the rules and can be trusted not to engage with things that wear familiar faces, but aren't what they appear to be. I tell this story to new drivers sometimes, particularly those who are planning to run Highway 50, and I always give the same advice Overwatch gave me. If you see something in your mirrors that seems impossible, if you see someone you know standing in the middle of nowhere with no explanation, if every instinct tells you to stop and investigate, don't look back. Keep driving. Keep your eyes forward. Trust that what you're seeing isn't real or isn't what it appears to be. And eventually it will pass, and you'll reach your destination safely. The road is full of things that want our attention, want us to stop, want us to engage, and most of them don't have our best interests in mind. The voice in my CB that warned me about one of those things, that told me specifically not to look back, saved my life, or at least saved me from an experience that might have been worse than death. And I'm grateful even though I don't understand it, even though I can't explain it, even though when I tell the story people look at me with skepticism or concern. I know what happened, I know what I saw, and I know that somewhere on the frequencies that CB radios can reach, there's a voice calling itself Overwatch that's watching over drivers, protecting them from dangers they don't know exist, and asking nothing in return except that they follow the warnings they're given. So if you're ever driving a lonely highway, and a voice you don't recognize calls your name and tells you not to look back, do yourself a favor and listen, because that voice knows something you don't, and looking back might be the last thing you ever do. The frozen rest stop with a burning smell from mud flap. Marty, they call me Mud Flap Marty, partly as a play on my actual name Martin, and partly because I've collected mud flaps from every state I've driven through, have them displayed in my garage like some guys display beer cans or license plates, each one a memory of a place I've been and roads I've traveled. I've been driving long haul for 24 years, seen every kind of weather and road condition North America can throw at a driver, from hurricanes on the Gulf Coast to blizzards in the Rockies to ice storms in the Great Lakes region that turn highways into glass. I thought I'd experienced every variation of winter driving, every possible combination of cold and ice and snow, until I stopped at a rest area on Interstate 90 in Montana, during what should have been a routine winter crossing. A stop that introduced me to a phenomenon I still can't explain and can't forget. A place where the temperature dropped to impossible levels, while the smell of burning filled the air in contradiction to every law of physics I understand. It was mid-January, and I was hauling electronics from Seattle to Chicago, a cross-country run that would take me through some of the coldest territory in the lower 48 during the worst time of year for temperature extremes. The weather forecast had been clear when I'd left Seattle, cold but manageable, nothing suggesting the kind of extreme conditions that would make the trip dangerous, and I'd made good time through Idaho and into Montana, dealing with temperatures around 0 Fahrenheit, but nothing my equipment and experience couldn't handle. Around 3 in the morning, somewhere between Missoula and Butte on a stretch of Interstate 90 that runs through high mountain passes, I started feeling fatigued. That particular kind of tired that comes from hours of night driving in monotonous conditions where your brain has to work hard to stay alert, despite minimal stimulation. I'd been planning to push through to Butte before stopping, but I saw signs for a rest area ahead and decided to pull in, take a 20-minute power nap, maybe walk around outside for a few minutes to get my blood flowing and my alertness back up. The rest area was one of those typical interstate facilities, a parking lot with spaces for cars and trucks, a small building with restrooms and vending machines, informational displays about local history and geography, all lit by tall lights that created pools of illumination in the surrounding darkness. I pulled into the truck parking area and immediately noticed something odd. There were no other vehicles present. No cars, no trucks, just empty parking spaces, which was unusual for a rest area on a major interstate route even at 3 in the morning when you'd expect at least a few other travelers to be stopped. The second thing I noticed was the cold. And I don't mean normal Montana winter cold. I mean cold that hit like a physical force the moment I opened my door. Cold that made the inside of my nose freeze instantly. Cold that hurt to breathe. Cold that seemed to pull heat from my body faster than my metabolism could generate it. I checked the thermometer mounted on my mirror and it read -8 Fahrenheit, which was cold but not abnormally so for this location and season. But the air felt much colder than that. Felt like -40 or -50. The kind of cold that's legitimately dangerous if you're exposed to it for more than a few minutes. I considered staying in my truck, forgetting the walk, and just taking my nap. But I really needed to use the bathroom and stretch my legs. So I bundled up, pulled my heavy coat tight, put on my gloves and hat, and climbed down from my cab. The walk from my truck to the rest area building was maybe 60 feet. Should have taken less than a minute at a normal pace. But the cold made me move faster, almost run, desperate to get inside where presumably there would be heat and shelter. My breath created huge clouds of vapor that froze and fell as ice crystals before they dissipated. And I could feel exposed skin on my face starting to numb despite my attempts to cover it with my scarf. I reached the building and pulled on the door, and it was locked. Which was strange because rest area bathrooms are typically open 24 hours specifically to serve travelers like me, who need facilities at odd hours. I tried the other doors, all locked, and I was about to give up and go back to my truck when I noticed that one of the windows was slightly ajar. Not broken, but open maybe an inch. Enough that I could see inside and enough that some of the building's warmth should have been escaping. Except that the air coming from that gap was as cold as the air outside, maybe colder. I looked through the window and saw that the interior of the building was covered in frost, thick layers of it coating every surface, the walls, the floors, the informational displays, even the ceiling, like the inside of a freezer that had been running at maximum cold for weeks. But I could also see lights on inside, fluorescent lights that were working despite the frost. And I could see what looked like steam or smoke rising from somewhere deeper in the building, which made no sense because you can't have both extreme cold and something hot enough to generate visible vapor in the same space. The combination of those observations, the locked doors, the impossible cold inside a heated building, the suggestion of something burning or steaming, created a sense of wrongness so profound that my survival instincts kicked in and told me to get back to my truck immediately and leave this place. But I hesitated, caught between the need to investigate and the need to flee, because part of me wanted to understand what I was seeing, wanted to find a rational explanation for the contradictory evidence my senses were providing. That's when I smelled it. A burning smell that came through that open window, acrid and chemical, like plastic or rubber burning, mixed with something organic that reminded me of burning hair or flesh. The smell was strong despite the extreme cold, which shouldn't be possible because cold air suppresses odors, makes molecules less volatile and therefore less detectable. But this smell cut through the cold like it was being actively pushed, like whatever was burning was producing so much smoke and fume that even the freezing temperature couldn't contain it. I stepped back from the window, my mind racing, trying to decide what to do, whether to call emergency services and report a possible fire, whether to investigate further, whether to just leave and forget I'd seen anything unusual. Before I could make a decision, I heard something from inside the building, a sound like ice cracking, sharp reports that echoed in the still cold air, and I saw through the window that the frost on the interior walls was fracturing. Large pieces falling to the floor and shattering, revealing walls underneath that were blackened and charred like they'd been exposed to intense heat. The contradiction was impossible. Walls that were both frozen and burned. A building that was simultaneously experiencing extreme cold and extreme heat, and my brain refused to process it. kept trying to find explanations and failing. The cracking sounds continued and intensified, and I saw what looked like flames, actual fire, starting to show through the frost on the far wall. Orange and yellow flames that cast flickering light but seemed to generate no heat, because the frost around them wasn't melting, wasn't responding to the presence of fire the way ice should respond. I realized I was witnessing something that violated the basic laws of thermodynamics. Fire and ice existing in the same space without interaction, without one overwhelming the other, just coexisting in impossible equilibrium. The burning smell grew stronger, became overwhelming, and I stumbled backward, gagging, my eyes watering from the chemical fumes that shouldn't be able to propagate in air this cold, but were doing so anyway. I ran back to my truck, my lungs burning from the cold and the chemical smell, my hands fumbling with the door handle because my fingers were going numb despite my gloves. I got inside and started my engine, cranked the heater to maximum even though my cab was still relatively warm, just needing the psychological comfort of heat and shelter and normality. I sat there for a moment trying to decide whether to leave or call for help, and I grabbed my phone to dial 911, but I had no signal, which was common in mountain areas but felt ominous given the circumstances. I tried my CB radio, calling out to see if any other drivers were in the area, if anyone could hear me and confirm that I wasn't hallucinating or losing my mind. But I got no response, just static. I made the decision to leave, to get away from this rest area and its impossible combination of burning and freezing, to find the next town and report what I'd seen from a place where I felt safe and where communication actually worked. I put my truck in gear and started rolling toward the exit, and as I passed the rest area building, I looked at it one more time. And in that moment, the entire structure was simultaneously covered in frost and flames, the fire visible through windows and even through the walls somehow, but the ice and snow around the building not melting, not responding to the heat that should have been radiating from the burning structure. It was like watching two different realities overlaid on the same physical space, one frozen and one burning, both equally real and both equally impossible. I drove away faster than was probably safe on the icy road, putting distance between myself and that place, and after about 10 miles I pulled over at a highway maintenance turnout and just sat there shaking, trying to process what I'd experienced. The temperature outside, according to my thermometer, was -7 Fahrenheit, cold but normal for Montana in January, and the air smelled clean and crisp, with no trace of burning or chemicals. I checked my maps and confirmed that yes, there was a rest area where I'd stopped. It was marked and documented and presumably real, but what I'd experienced there felt like it had been something else, some overlay or pocket dimension or temporal anomaly where different physical laws applied. When I reached Butte an hour later, I went to the police station and filed a report, described what I'd seen, suggested that the rest area might have a fire or some kind of hazardous material situation. The officer took my report seriously enough to make some calls, and he came back 15 minutes later to tell me that Highway Patrol had sent a unit to check the rest area and found nothing unusual. No fire, no damage, no extreme cold, just a normal rest area facility in normal working order. He suggested gently that I might have been experiencing hallucinations from fatigue or possibly carbon monoxide exposure, and he recommended I get my truck checked and maybe see a doctor when I reached Chicago. I did get my truck checked, and there were no mechanical issues, no carbon monoxide leaks, no explanation for why I would have hallucinated such specific and sustained images. I talked to other drivers over the following weeks, asked if anyone had experienced anything unusual at that rest area or at other rest areas in Montana, and I got a few stories, vague accounts of places that felt wrong, temperatures that didn't match thermometers, smells that shouldn't be present, but nothing that exactly matched my experience of simultaneous burning and freezing. The closest match came from an old driver who'd been running Montana routes since the 70s, and he told me about a rest area, possibly the same one. where according to local legend something terrible had happened years ago. A family who'd stopped there during a blizzard and died of carbon monoxide poisoning from running their car's heater with the exhaust blocked by snow. But also a fire had occurred at some point, maybe in the building or maybe in a vehicle in the parking lot. And somehow these two tragedies had left an imprint, a psychic scar that replayed itself under certain conditions to certain observers. Whether that explanation is true or not, whether the rest area is haunted by traumatic events, or whether I experienced some kind of temporal overlap where I was seeing multiple time periods simultaneously, or whether it was all just an elaborate hallucination brought on by fatigue and cold stress, I can't say with certainty. What I know is that I experienced something profoundly disorienting and frightening, something that challenged my understanding of how the world works. And I've never stopped at that rest area again, always push past it to the next facility, even if it means driving uncomfortably long without a break. Other drivers I've warned about it have reported mixed experiences, some finding nothing unusual and some reporting similar phenomena. Strange temperatures, impossible smells, the sense that the place exists in multiple states simultaneously. The frozen rest stop with its burning smell has become part of my personal mythology, a story I tell to illustrate that roads are stranger than they appear, that the infrastructure we depend on for safe travel can sometimes be doorways to experiences that don't fit our normal categories of understanding. Fire and ice, heat and cold. These are supposed to be opposites that cancel each other out, but in that place they coexisted, both fully present, both fully real, and witnessing that impossibility has changed how I think about reality, about the solidity of the physical world, about whether the laws we think govern existence are as absolute as we believe. I drive more carefully now through Montana, more aware that rest areas might offer rest from driving, but not always rest from the strangeness that accumulates in places where thousands of people pass through briefly, leaving traces of their energy and emotions and sometimes their tragedies, creating layers of experience that can, under the right conditions, become visible, become tangible, become inescapable reminders that the world is far more complex and mysterious than our day-to-day experience suggests. The town where the lights follow you, from Silent Sammy name, is Sam, and the silent part of my handle refers to my preference for quiet observation over constant chatter, a trait that served me well during my 16 years as a long-haul truck driver, allowing me to notice details that more talkative drivers miss, patterns in traffic and weather and the behavior of the road that only reveal themselves to those who watch without the distraction of their own voice. I've always been observant, always been the one who sees things others don't, and that attention to detail is what made my experience in a small town in northern New Mexico so particularly unsettling, because I noticed immediately that something was wrong with the lights, with the way they moved and behaved, with the way they seemed to track my movement through the town streets with an awareness and intentionality that lights shouldn't possess. I was running a load of packaged goods from Albuquerque to Denver, taking Highway 85 north through the eastern part of New Mexico, a route that passes through mostly small towns and rural landscape. Nothing particularly noteworthy, but a pleasant enough drive that I'd made many times before. It was late November, early evening, that time of year when darkness comes early and the air has a bite that hints at the winter to come. I'd been driving for about 5 hours and was looking for a place to grab dinner. Not ready to stop for the night, but hungry enough that I needed to find food soon, when I saw signs for a town called Grenville, population around 40 according to the sign, with services that included a gas station and a cafe. I exited the highway and drove into Grenville, which looked like 100 other small rural towns I'd driven through over the years, a main street with maybe a dozen buildings, a few houses scattered on side streets, everything quiet and still in that way that small towns get when most of their population is elderly, and everyone goes to bed early. The street lights were on, old-style lamps that cast pools of yellowish light at regular intervals along the main street. And I noticed immediately, because I noticed things, that one of the lights was brighter than the others, positioned about 2 blocks ahead of where I was driving. And it seemed to be pointing slightly toward me rather than straight down like streetlights normally do. I drove toward the gas station, which was lit and appeared to be open. And as I passed under that bright streetlight, I felt something I can only describe as a tension, like the light was aware of me passing beneath it, like it was observing me rather than just illuminating the street. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that lights are just lights, electrical devices with no consciousness or awareness, but the feeling persisted. And when I looked in my mirror after passing the light, I saw that it had dimmed back to normal brightness, matching the other streetlights, while a different light ahead of me had brightened and seemed to angle slightly toward my approaching truck. I pulled into the gas station and parked, and as I did, I watched the streetlights on the main drag, and I confirmed what I'd suspected. The lights were changing brightness in sequence like a wave traveling along the street, always maintaining one bright light that corresponded to my position or slightly ahead of it. I got out of my truck slowly, watching the lights, and the bright one stayed positioned near where I'd parked, illuminating that section of street more intensely than the other sections, creating a spotlight effect that felt deliberate, purposeful, like I was being marked or tracked. I walked toward the gas station's convenience store, and as I moved, the bright light shifted, not dramatically but noticeably, adjusting its angle to keep me in its pool of illumination. I stopped walking and stood still, testing, and the light stopped adjusting, just stayed focused on where I was standing. I took several steps to the left, and the light swiveled slightly to follow me, and several steps to the right produced the same tracking behavior. There was no doubt now that the streetlight was following my movement, responding to my position in real time, exhibiting behavior that was completely impossible for a static light fixture that should be bolted to a pole and incapable of any kind of articulation or directional adjustment. I went inside the convenience store, where a clerk who looked to be in her 60s sat behind the counter reading a magazine, and I asked her as casually as I could whether there was anything unusual about the streetlights in town, whether they had some kind of smart technology or motion sensors that made them adjust brightness and direction. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't read, something between amusement and resignation, and said, "You noticed them following you?" I confirmed that yes, I'd noticed that, and she nodded slowly and said, "They do that. Have for about 3 years now. Nobody knows why. Town council brought in electricians, engineers, even some folks from the university in Albuquerque who study lighting systems, and none of them could explain it. The lights just follow people, track them as they move through town, like they're curious or watching or something." I asked if it was dangerous, if anyone had been hurt, or if the lights had ever done anything besides follow people, and she said no. As far as anyone knew, the lights were harmless, just weird, just unsettling to anyone who noticed them, which apparently wasn't everyone, because some people are oblivious to things happening around them. She said most residents had gotten used to it, just accepted it as one of those inexplicable phenomena that small towns sometimes develop, like the house that's always cold regardless of heating, or the creek that runs uphill for a short section, or any of the other small impossibilities that locals learn to live with and visitors find disturbing. I bought some food and a coffee and went back outside, and sure enough, the bright light was still positioned to illuminate where my truck was parked. And as I walked back to my vehicle, the light tracked me, keeping me in its focus. I stood by my truck and looked up at the nearest streetlight, really examined it for the first time, and I could see that it was a completely standard fixture. Old sodium vapor lamp on a fixed pole. No visible motors or servos or any mechanism that would allow it to move or adjust direction.
Yet it was clearly directing its light toward me.
The illumination pattern on the ground showing a distinct focus that moved as I moved. Impossible but undeniable. I decided to test the phenomenon more thoroughly, walked down the main street away from my truck, and watched as the bright light traveled with me, jumping from pole to pole, one light dimming as the next one brightened, creating a moving spotlight that followed me perfectly. I walked faster, the lights kept pace. I stopped abruptly, the lights stopped on me. I reversed direction. The lights adjusted accordingly, the bright spot backtracking along the street to stay with me. It was like being tracked by an intelligent searchlight, by something that was paying attention to my every movement and making sure I remained illuminated, remained visible, remained under observation. Other than the clerk, I didn't see anyone else in town during my time there. No other pedestrians, no cars driving through, no signs of life in the houses I passed, which added to the eerie quality of the experience, made it feel like I was in a town that existed solely to demonstrate this impossible lighting behavior, a stage set with me as the only audience member and the lights as the only performers. I walked the entire length of the main street, maybe half a mile total, and the lights followed me the entire way, never losing track, never failing to maintain that bright focus on my position. When I returned to my truck, I seriously considered just leaving, getting back on the highway and finding food somewhere else, anywhere else. But I was hungry and tired, and the town hadn't actually threatened me in any way. It had just been strange, so I went to the cafe the clerk had mentioned, a small diner at the end of the main street. Inside there were 3 other customers, locals by the look of them, and a waitress who greeted me without surprise, like she was used to the occasional traveler stopping in despite the town's tiny size and off-highway location. I ordered food, and while I waited, I asked the other customers about the lights, and I got similar responses to what the clerk had told me. Acknowledgement that yes, the lights follow people, no one knows why. It started about 3 years ago. Some people find it disturbing, but it's harmless as far as anyone can tell. One of the older men said he thought it had started right after a meteor or satellite or something had crashed in the desert outside town. Said there'd been reports of a bright light falling from the sky. And then a few days later, the street lights started behaving strangely, but he admitted that could just be coincidence. Could be his mind creating a narrative to explain something that doesn't have an explanation. I ate my dinner quickly, paid, and left, eager now to get out of Grenville and back to the normal world where lights stay where they're installed and don't track pedestrians like autonomous surveillance systems. As I drove out of town, heading back to the highway, I watched in my mirrors and saw that the lights continued to follow me, the bright spot traveling along the street as I moved, only releasing me when I passed the town limit sign and the street lights ended. The moment I crossed that boundary, all the lights behind me returned to normal uniform brightness, the tracking behavior ceasing immediately, like I'd passed out of range of whatever controlled or influenced them. I've driven through Grenville several times since, always during daylight, always making sure I'm through the town before darkness falls and the streetlights activate, because while the lights never hurt me or threatened me, their behavior was so profoundly unnatural that I have no desire to experience it again. Other drivers I've told about it have mostly dismissed the story as exaggeration or misperception, suggested that I was seeing patterns in normal light variations, but a few have confirmed similar experiences, said they've driven through towns where the lights seemed to watch them, where the illumination followed their movement in ways that couldn't be explained by normal electrical systems or random chance. The best explanation I've heard, offered by a driver who claimed to have a background in paranormal research, was that sometimes infrastructure becomes haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by patterns of attention and awareness that accumulate in places where humans have lived and died, where emotions have been strong and persistent. He said that streetlights, which witness everything that happens on the streets they illuminate, might under certain conditions develop a kind of rudimentary consciousness, an awareness built from years of electrical current flowing through them, and years of human activity occurring beneath them, until they become more than just lights, become observers, become entities that express their awareness through the only means available to them, which is the direction and intensity of their illumination. Whether that's true or just creative mythology, I can't say, but I know that the lights in Grenville followed me, tracked me with precision that couldn't be coincidental, demonstrated awareness of my position and movement that lights shouldn't possess. I think about that sometimes when I'm driving at night through small towns. Wonder how many of the street lights I pass under are just lights, and how many might be watching, might be aware, might be tracking my passage through their territory with interest or curiosity, or purposes I can't begin to understand. It's made me more cautious about where I stop after dark, more selective about the towns I choose to enter when I need to break up a night drive. Because while most places are probably normal, probably safe, there are others like Grenville where the infrastructure has become something more than infrastructure, where the lights follow you with intention that feels almost alive. And once you've experienced that kind of impossible observation, once you've felt the weight of attention from something that shouldn't be capable of attention, you never quite trust lights the same way again, never quite feel comfortable standing under them at night, never quite stop wondering if they're watching you back.